Imagine the only world you have ever known is also a machine, and that machine has to keep running perfectly without stopping for 500 years. No rescue, no second chances. Just a thin wall of metal between 8,000 human beings and the coldest, emptiest environment in the universe. That is the reality of a generation ship. How long before something breaks? Not the ship, I mean the people. If this kind of question pulls at something in you, make sure to give this video a like. Now let's get started. So what exactly is a generation ship? The core concept is deceptively straightforward, even if the reality of it is anything but. A generation ship, sometimes called a world ship or a multi-generational vessel, is a spacecraft so large and embarked on a journey so long that the crew who boards it at the beginning are not the people who arrive at the destination. The men and women who strap in and watch the Earth shrink behind them in the viewport. They live out their whole lives on board. They fall in love, raise families, grow old, and are buried in whatever ritual the ship's community has developed to honor its dead. Their children do the same, and their children's children, and on, for generation after generation, the cycle repeating in that closed metal world, until at last some distant descendant of the original crew opens an airlock for the first time and steps out onto a world their ancestors only ever dreamed about. Let that sink in for a moment. You are not just asking people to sacrifice their own lives for a mission. You are making decisions on behalf of people who have not been born yet. People who will never have a choice about where they live, what world they belong to, or what purpose their existence is meant to serve. There is something that feels simultaneously magnificent and morally vertiginous about that. So why would we even consider it? Because space is not just big. Space is incomprehensibly, almost offensively enormous. The nearest star to our own sun is Proxima Centauri, and it sits at roughly 4.2 light-years away. Now, I know that sounds like a number, but I want you to actually feel it. Light travels at nearly 300,000 kilometers every single second. In 1 year, it covers approximately 9.5 trillion kilometers. Proxima Centauri is 4.2 of those years away. And our fastest spacecraft, the fastest object humanity has ever built and launched into space, would need something in the range of 70,000 years to reach it at their current velocities. 70,000 years. That is longer than anatomically modern humans have been building civilizations. That is longer than we have had written language, agriculture, cities, philosophy, all of it combined, and then some. Even if we could accelerate a crewed spacecraft to 1% of the speed of light, which is an almost unimaginable leap beyond anything we have ever achieved, the journey to Proxima Centauri alone would still take roughly 420 years. Multiple human lifetimes, multiple generations. That is precisely why the concept of a generation ship exists. Because the universe does not care about our lifespans. And if we ever want to send living people to the stars, truly send them, not just a signal or a tiny autonomous probe, we need a vessel that can carry not just a crew, but the entire human project, birth, death, culture, memory, purpose, across the void between suns. And speaking of that journey to Proxima Centauri, here is something I want to point out. If you want to understand just how strange and genuinely terrifying that specific trip would be, I made a video that goes deep on exactly that. On the card above, we explore why the journey to Proxima Centauri is scarier than you think, and it pairs with today's video in a way that I think you will really appreciate. The link is on the description and pinned on the comments. Now, the ship itself, here is where the scale of the challenge truly starts to reveal itself, and I want to open a loop here that we are going to come back to, because it is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the entire generation ship problem. The longest any human-made spacecraft has ever operated continuously in deep space is the Voyager probes. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were both launched back in 1977, nearly 5 decades ago, and as of the time I am making this video, they are still technically operational, still transmitting data from beyond the edge of our solar system, from a distance so vast that even at the speed of light, their signals take more than 20 hours to reach us. That is genuinely extraordinary. It is one of the great quiet triumphs of human engineering. But here is the thing. Voyager 1 is roughly the size of a small automobile. It has no crew, it grows no food, it recycles no air. It does not need to maintain atmospheric pressure, regulate internal temperature for living bodies, manage a water supply, deal with human waste, run a medical facility, or do anything except drift through space and occasionally rotate its antenna. And even so, even with that level of simplicity, its nuclear power source is fading. Its instruments are being switched off one by one to conserve the dwindling energy. Slowly, inevitably, it is going quiet. The engineers at NASA who still monitor it are, in a real sense, watching it die in slow motion. And they are doing so with a kind of reverent sadness because they know there is nothing they can do to stop it. Now imagine a vessel that has to do everything Voyager does not. A ship that has to keep hundreds, perhaps thousands, of human beings alive, warm, nourished, breathing clean air, drinking clean water, maintaining their physical and mental health, not for 50 years, but for 500 or 1,000 or longer. Every pipe, every seal, every structural weld, every electronic circuit, every filter, every pump, each one of these systems has to either survive the entire voyage intact or be fixable using nothing but the materials and knowledge available within the ship itself. There is no supply mission coming. There is no support call you can make. There is no rescue. You are alone in the dark between stars, and whatever breaks, you fix or you face the consequences. The engineering challenge this poses is not just large. It is a category of problem that human civilization has genuinely never attempted to solve before. We do not have a great track record of building things that last for centuries without external maintenance. The oldest continuously functioning mechanical clock in the world is only around 600 years old, and it has been repaired, serviced, and adjusted throughout its entire life by generations of clockmakers. We have never built a sealed, self-sustaining mechanical system and said, this needs to run on its own, without any outside input for 1,000 years. We have never come anywhere close to attempting that, and yet that is precisely what a generation ship would demand. So how do you even begin to design for that? What materials do you choose? What redundancies do you build in? How do you account for failure modes that no one can predict? These are not rhetorical questions. Engineers and materials scientists are actively working on frameworks for thinking through exactly this problem. And some of the answers they are arriving at are genuinely surprising. But the physical structure of the ship, as enormous a challenge as that is, turns out to be almost the easier part of the equation. Because the real survival question is not whether the metal holds, it is whether the people inside do. And here is where I want to leave you before we move into the next part, because what comes next is one of the most counterintuitive, genuinely startling findings in all of Generationship science. It has to do with a number, a specific number, the number of people you would need on board for the mission to have any realistic chance of success. And here is what makes it so fascinating. That number has almost nothing to do with how much food you can grow, or how much living space you have, or how many people it takes to operate the ship's systems. It has everything to do with something far more ancient, something written into every strand of DNA in every cell of your body, something shaped by millions of years of evolution long before the first human ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Get that number wrong even slightly, and the mission does not fail with a bang. There is no explosion, no alarm, no single catastrophic moment. It fails quietly, invisibly, written into the biology of the people themselves, unfolding across generations so slowly that no one on board even realizes it is happening. Until it is already far, there is a forest in Poland that has been standing for approximately 10,000 years. It is called Biosphere. It sits on the border between Poland and Belarus, and it is one of the last and largest remaining fragments of the primeval forest that once stretched across the entire European continent after the last ice age retreated. It has never been cleared, never been replanted, never been managed in the way that most modern forests are managed, with selective harvesting, pest control, and deliberate species introduction. It has simply been left to be itself. And what it has become over 10 millennia of uninterrupted ecological process is something that professional ecologists describe in language that sounds almost reverent. It is not just old trees, it is a system, a vast, interlocking, mutually sustaining network of relationships between thousands of species of trees, fungi, bacteria, insects, birds, mammals, and microorganisms, all of them connected in ways that are still not fully understood, all of them contributing to a collective resilience that allows the forest to absorb disturbances, recover from damage, and continue functioning across timescales that dwarf any human institution. When a tree falls in Biosphere, it does not simply rot and disappear. It becomes a habitat, a nursery for fungi, a feeding ground for beetle larvae, a moisture reservoir that sustains mosses and lichens, a slow-release nutrient store that feeds the roots of neighboring trees for decades. The falling of one tree is, in a sense, the beginning of 100 other stories. Nothing is wasted, nothing is lost. Every death becomes a contribution to the continuing life of the system as a whole. I want you to hold that image, that ancient, self-sustaining, endlessly cycling living system, as we talk about what the most forward-thinking generation ship designers are actually proposing. Because the most compelling visions for long-duration interstellar vessels are not engineering blueprints in the traditional sense. They are, at their core, attempts to replicate something like Biosphere, not a machine, a living system. One where the goal is not to prevent change and degradation, which the second law of thermodynamics guarantees is impossible, but to build something resilient enough and adaptive enough to persist and renew itself across the full span of the journey. The technical term for what we are talking about is a closed ecological life support system, sometimes abbreviated as CELS. But that clinical acronym does not quite capture what the most ambitious versions of this concept actually envision. The idea, at its fullest expression, is to build not just a life support system, but a genuine miniature biosphere, a self-contained slice of Earth's living complexity, transplanted into space and maintained not primarily by mechanical systems that will eventually fail, but by biological processes that have been refining themselves for 3.5 billion years and are, in a very real sense, far more robust and self-correcting than anything human engineers have ever built. Think about what Earth's biosphere actually does. It recycles every atom of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and every other biologically important element through continuous cycles of life, death, decomposition, and renewal. It generates its own atmospheric composition, maintaining the precise blend of gases that complex life requires. It regulates temperature through feedback loops that involve the oceans, the atmosphere, living organisms, and the geological processes of the planet's crust. It produces its own energy currency, the sugars generated by photosynthesis, from nothing more than sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. It repairs damage, it adapts to perturbation, it evolves. Now, obviously, you cannot put the entire Earth biosphere inside a spacecraft. The Earth's biosphere is, among other things, sustained by the energy of a star, the buffering capacity of a global ocean, the chemical cycling capacity of a planetary-scale lithosphere, and the evolutionary experimentation of trillions upon trillions of organisms across billions of years. You cannot replicate that. But the question that researchers in closed ecological life support are genuinely asking is, how much of that complexity do you need to capture? What is the minimum viable biosphere? The smallest, simplest, most efficiently designed slice of Earth's living complexity that could sustain a human community indefinitely in deep space. And here is what the research suggests. The answer is not a simple hydroponic farm with a few varieties of lettuce and some algae tanks, appealing as that image might be in its tidiness. The answer is something significantly richer and more complex than that. Something that feels less like a factory and more like a garden, or perhaps more like that ancient forest. The key concept is trophic complexity, the diversity of feeding relationships within an ecosystem. In a simple agricultural system, the kind you might imagine on a basic space station, you have a few crop species, some bacteria for waste decomposition, and humans at the top of the food chain. The system is efficient and controllable, but it is also brittle. Remove one species, disrupt one process, and the whole thing can cascade toward failure very quickly. There are not enough redundant pathways, not enough alternative routes for nutrients and energy to flow through, to absorb the loss. A more complex ecosystem, one with a richer food web, more diverse microbial communities, a wider variety of plant species, perhaps some invertebrate and small vertebrate species as well, is more robust precisely because of its complexity. If one species is lost or disrupted, others can partially fill its functional role. The system has buffers, redundancies, alternative pathways. It can absorb perturbation and recover. This is one of the fundamental insights of modern ecology, and it has direct implications for Generationship design. The Melissa project, which we touched on in the previous part, is moving in this direction. Its later phases have incorporated increasingly complex biological communities, not just simple bacterial cultures and algae, but higher plants, more diverse microbial ecosystems, precisely because the research has confirmed what ecological theory predicts. More biological complexity yields more system stability, more resilience, a greater capacity to self-correct when something goes wrong. But if we are going to build a genuine miniature biosphere on a generation ship, we have to confront a question that is simultaneously practical and deeply philosophical. Which species do you take with you? Not just crops, not just the organisms that directly feed the humans on board. Which of the millions of species that make up Earth's biosphere do you consider essential to the system's long-term function? Because every species you include adds mass, adds complexity, adds the metabolic demands of that organism to the ship's resource budget. But every species you leave out is a functional role in the ecosystem that might be missed, sometimes in ways that are not immediately obvious. Here is a concrete example. Mycorrhizal fungi, the networks of fungal threads that form symbiotic relationships with the roots of most land plants, extending their effective root area enormously and facilitating the transfer of nutrients between plants and soil organisms, are invisible. You would not notice them if you walk through a garden, but remove them and the plants they support become dramatically less healthy, less productive, and more vulnerable to stress. The relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots is ancient. It dates back at least 450 million years to the earliest land plants, and it is one of the foundation stones of terrestrial plant ecology. If you build a Generationship's agricultural system without them, you have built an ecosystem with a missing pillar, and mycorrhizal fungi are just one example among thousands. Soil bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can use, decomposer organisms, bacteria, fungi, invertebrates, that break down dead organic matter and return its nutrients to the cycle. Pollinating insects if you are growing plants that require pollination to produce fruit or seed. The gut microbiome, the trillions of microorganisms living inside every human digestive tract, without which human digestion, immune function, and even mental health are significantly impaired. Every one of these is a living component of the biosphere that the ship's human inhabitants depend on, often without realizing it. The concept of bringing a comprehensive biobank, not just human genetic material, as we discussed in an earlier part, but seeds, spores, bacterial cultures, fungal cultures, cryopreserved animal cells, and even preserved soil microbial communities from diverse Earth ecosystems is taken very seriously by researchers in this space. The Noah's Ark metaphor is almost irresistible, and in this context it is not entirely inappropriate. You would be loading a vessel with the living diversity of Earth, carefully selected, carefully preserved, carefully managed, and carrying it across the void to a new world. But here is a layer of this that I find particularly thought-provoking, and that I do not think gets enough attention. The ecological model of the Generationship does not just change how we think about life support. It changes how we think about the relationship between the crew and the ship. It changes the fundamental character of life on board. In the purely mechanical model of a generation ship, the one where life support is a set of engineered systems that humans operate and maintain, the relationship between the crew and the ship is essentially that of operators to machines. The ship is a tool, the humans run it. Their job is to keep the tool working, and as we have discussed, that relationship extended across multiple generations can become psychologically corrosive. When the tool is your entire world, when there is nothing outside it, when its walls are the boundary of your existence, being its servant starts to feel less like a purpose and more like a sentence. But in the ecological model, where the ship contains a genuine living system, complex and dynamic, and requiring not just mechanical maintenance but genuine ecological stewardship, the relationship is fundamentally different. The crew are not just operators. They are participants in a living system. They are, in a meaningful sense, part of the ecosystem themselves. Their role is not just to keep machines running, but to tend a garden, to observe and understand a complex biological community, to make nuanced decisions about ecological balance, to notice when something is off and understand why, to see the system as something alive, something they belong to, not just something they maintain. That is a profoundly different psychological relationship. And the psychological literature on human connection to living systems, what the biologist E.O. Wilson called biophilia, our deep, evolved affinity for other living things, suggests that it matters enormously for well-being. Studies in everything from hospital recovery rates to prison behavior to urban mental health have consistently shown that access to living nature, plants, animals, soil, the sounds and smells of a living ecosystem has measurable positive effects on human psychological health. In the isolated, constrained environment of a generation ship, those effects would not be a luxury. They would be part of the ship's life support system in the fullest sense of the term. There is a related concept that I want to bring in here, because it connects the ecological model of the ship to the social and cultural questions we explored in the previous part. It is the idea of meaningful work, work that connects you to something larger than yourself, that requires genuine skill and knowledge, that produces visible results, and that the community around you recognizes as valuable. One of the quieter crises in modern industrial societies is the widespread sense, documented across numerous sociological studies, that many people's work is fundamentally disconnected from anything they can see, touch, or feel proud of. The abstraction of labor in complex economies, where your specific task is so far removed from any tangible output that it is difficult to feel that it matters. is associated with elevated rates of disengagement, depression, and what the anthropologist David Graeber memorably called bullshit jobs, positions that even the people occupying them privately acknowledge to serve no clear purpose. On a generation ship with a genuine living ecosystem, a ship that contains forests and gardens and biological communities that require active stewardship, almost no one is at risk of experiencing their work as disconnected from anything real. Every person on board would have a visible, tangible role in the maintenance of a living system that their survival depends on. The farmer who tends the wheat bays sees the grain grow. The ecologist who monitors the microbial balance of the composting system sees, in the health of the plants that the compost feeds, the direct result of their work. The doctor who maintains the crew's health sees their patients recover. The engineer who fixes the water recycler sees the clean water flowing. The teacher who transmits the accumulated knowledge of the voyage to the next generation sees that knowledge living on in the children they taught. This is not utopia. It is not a guarantee of happiness or fulfillment for every individual in every generation. Human beings are complex and varied, and the sources of their suffering are correspondingly complex and varied. But it is a social architecture that provides, at least structurally, the conditions that psychological research consistently identifies as prerequisites for human flourishing: meaningful work, clear social roles, connection to living systems, visible contribution to collective survival. Now, I want to introduce a concept that takes everything we have been building toward and pushes it one step further. Because the ecological model of the generation ship is compelling, but there is a more radical version of it that some researchers and space settlement theorists are actively exploring, and it is one that, in my view, represents the most honest confrontation with the full scale of what an interstellar journey would actually mean. It is called the world ship, not a generation ship, a world ship. And the difference is not just one of scale, though scale is certainly part of it. The conceptual difference is more fundamental. A generation ship, even a large and ecologically rich one, is still fundamentally oriented toward a destination. It is a vessel in transit. Its purpose is the journey's end. The mission is arrival. A world ship is something else. A world ship is a vessel so large and designed with such genuine ecological and social completeness that it is not really a vessel in transit at all. It is a world, a civilization, a complete human society that happens to be moving through space. The destination, if it has one at all, and some world ship proposals do not, is almost secondary to the ongoing project of the ship itself. The life lived on board is not a sacrifice made in service of a future arrival. It is the point, it is the civilization, it is the human story, continuing. The physicist and mathematician Freeman Dyson, one of the most creative and wide-ranging scientific minds of the 20th century, was one of the earliest serious thinkers about world ships. Dyson imagined vessels kilometers or even tens of kilometers in scale, carrying populations of hundreds of thousands or even millions, with interior spaces large enough to contain genuine climates, topographies, bodies of water, wild ecosystems alongside agricultural ones, not a spacecraft that happens to support human life, a world that happens to be capable of interstellar travel. At that scale, many of the problems we have been discussing begin to look different. Population genetics is no longer a crisis when your founding population is measured in the hundreds of thousands. Monoculture fragility in the ecosystem is no longer a concern when your agricultural system is embedded within a rich and diverse biosphere large enough to maintain genuine ecological complexity. The psychological problem of mission abandonment begins to dissolve when the mission is not really a mission anymore. It is just life. The civilization aboard is not sacrificing itself for a distant future. It is living its present. The engineering challenges of a world ship are obviously almost incomprehensible in their scale. We are talking about a structure that would make the International Space Station, already the largest object ever assembled in orbit, look like a wristwatch component. The materials required, the energy required to build it, let alone propel it, the timescales required for its construction in space, using robotic and human labor, probably over decades or centuries. All of this is far beyond our current capability, but here is what Dyson and the thinkers who have followed in his direction would say to that. Of course, it is beyond our current capability. So was every major step in human technological development, right up until it was not. The question is not whether we can build it today. The question is whether it is physically possible in principle, whether the laws of the universe permit it, and whether the goal is worthy of the effort of figuring out how. And the answer to both of those questions is yes. There is also a fascinating argument to be made that the world ship concept actually reduces overall risk compared to a smaller, more purpose-built generation ship, precisely because of its scale and ecological richness. A world ship with a population of 1 million people and a diverse, complex biosphere is not betting its survival on a single point of failure. It has redundancy at every level: biological, social, technical, cultural. The loss of any single system, any single species, any single community or knowledge tradition does not threaten the whole. The system is large enough and complex enough to absorb significant damage and recover. It is, in the ecological sense we have been exploring, genuinely resilient. But here is the thread I want to pull on as we move toward the next part of our exploration, because we have been assuming throughout most of this conversation something that I think deserves to be questioned directly. We have been assuming that a generation ship or a world ship would be traveling towards something, a destination, a specific star system with specific planets assessed from astronomical data as having some potential for human habitation or use. We have been assuming that the interstellar crossing is a means to an end, that the ship is a vehicle whose purpose is to deliver human beings from one place to another. But what if the destination is not what matters? What if the crossing itself, the long, strange, unprecedented human experience of living between the stars, changes the people involved in ways that we cannot predict from our comfortable vantage point on the surface of a warm, sunlit planet? What if the civilization that steps out at the far end of that journey is so different, culturally, philosophically, perhaps even biologically, from the one that stepped in at the beginning, that the concept of arrival stops meaning what we think it means? And there is an even deeper question underneath that one, a question that the latest findings in astronomy and astrophysics have sharpened considerably in recent years, because we now know, with a level of confidence that was simply not available to previous generations, that our galaxy contains an extraordinary abundance of planetary systems. The Kepler Space Telescope and its successor TESS, the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, have revealed that planets are not rare exceptions scattered through an otherwise empty galaxy. They are the rule. Nearly every star we have examined closely appears to have planets, and the number of those planets that fall within what astronomers call the habitable zone, close enough to their star for liquid water to exist on the surface, but not so close that the heat destroys it, is, by current estimates, almost staggeringly large. The precise number is debated, but one estimate, drawing on Kepler data, suggested that our galaxy alone may contain something in the order of 40 billion Earth-sized planets in the habitable zones of their stars. 40 billion. In one galaxy, out of the hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. Our galaxy, by the way, is entirely average, perhaps even on the smaller side. The universe, it appears, is genuinely saturated with the potential conditions for life. Now, Potential conditions for life are very different from actual inhabited worlds, and we will come back to that distinction in a moment. But for the question of generation ship destinations, this abundance of potentially habitable worlds is enormously relevant. It means that a generation ship does not need to bet everything on a single target. It could, in principle, travel toward the nearest candidate's system, assess it from close range for habitability, and if that system proves unsuitable, continue to the next one. The ship itself, if it is genuinely self-sustaining, does not need to arrive anywhere in particular. It needs to keep going until it finds somewhere worth stopping. That reframing from journey to a specific destination to ongoing expedition through a star-rich galaxy opens up a vision of interstellar civilization that is quite different from the one we usually imagine. And it connects to a question that has been sitting quietly underneath everything we have talked about today. A question that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the work of researchers at institutions like the SETI Institute in California, and the mathematical framework known as the Drake equation, forces us to confront, honestly, if interstellar travel is possible in principle, if the laws of physics permit it, if the engineering challenges can in principle be solved, then why, in a galaxy teeming with planetary systems and presumably teeming with the chemistry of life, do we see no evidence of civilizations that have done it? Why is the sky not filled with the signals of interstellar societies? Why? As the physicist Enrico Fermi famously asked over lunch in the summer of 1950, "Is nobody home?" The Fermi paradox, the apparent contradiction between the vast number of potentially inhabited worlds in the galaxy and the complete absence of any detectable evidence of extraterrestrial civilization, has dozens of proposed resolutions, some optimistic, some deeply sobering, and one of the most sobering ones has everything to do with the question we have been asking today. It is called the Great Filter, and the possibility that it lies ahead of us rather than behind us is, in my view, one of the most important and underappreciated ideas in all of modern science. We are going to go there next, because the question of how long a generation ship could survive in deep space is ultimately a question that is much larger than engineering. It is a question about the long-term fate of intelligent civilizations, about whether the universe is a place that tends to produce stories with good endings, or whether the silence out there in the dark is telling us something we are not yet ready to hear. Too late to do anything about it. That is what we are getting into next. Let us talk about genetics. And I know, the moment some people hear that word, their eyes start to glaze over. But stay with me, because what the science of genetics reveals about generation ships is not dry or technical. It is, honestly, one of the most quietly terrifying things I have ever researched for this channel, and once you understand it, you will never think about human survival in space or anywhere else. Quite the same way again, here is the question at the heart of it. How many people do you need? Not how many people do you want, not how many would be comfortable or convenient or logistically manageable. How many do you actually need at the absolute minimum for the population inside a generation ship to remain genetically healthy across hundreds of years and dozens of generations? Because here is the thing that surprises almost everyone when they first encounter this research. The answer is not 10, it is not 50, it is not even a few hundred. The numbers that come out of serious, peer-reviewed population genetics research are larger and more complicated than most people expect, and the reasoning behind them cuts right to the core of what we are as a species. To understand why, you need to understand a concept called genetic diversity. Your DNA, every single one of the roughly 3 billion base pairs coiled up inside the nucleus of each of your cells, is not identical to anyone else's on Earth. Not your parents, not your siblings, not your identical twin, if you happen to have one. Every human being carries a unique combination of genetic variants accumulated across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, migration, adaptation, and random chance. Some of those variants are immediately useful. They code for immune responses, metabolic efficiency, disease resistance. Others are neutral, just sitting quietly in the genome without any obvious effect. And some are potentially harmful, but are kept in check because they are recessive, meaning they only cause problems if a person inherits two copies of the variant, one from each parent. In a large, diverse population, the chances of that happening for any given harmful variant are low. The gene pool is vast enough that those dangerous combinations rarely meet, but shrink the population down, shrink it dramatically, and suddenly, the mathematics change in a very unforgiving way. This is what geneticists call the founder effect. When a small group of individuals breaks away from a larger population and establishes a new community in isolation, the genetic diversity of that new community is limited, sometimes drastically, to whatever happened to be present in those founding individuals. Think of it like taking a handful of sand from a vast beach. That handful contains some of the beach's variety, but nowhere near all of it. And if that small group then breeds only among themselves, generation after generation, the same variants keep showing up, the same combinations keep repeating, and the harmful recessives, the ones that were safely diluted in the larger gene pool, start to accumulate. They start to meet each other. They start to express. This process even has a name: inbreeding depression. And it is not theoretical. We have watched it happen in real populations, both human and animal. One of the most studied examples involves the cheetah. Modern cheetahs are, from a genetic standpoint, extraordinarily uniform, far more so than almost any other large mammal on Earth. Geneticists believe this is because the species went through a severe population bottleneck at some point in the distant past, possibly around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, when the total number of cheetahs dropped to something close to a handful of individuals. Every cheetah alive today is descended from that tiny surviving group, and the consequences are visible. Cheetahs show dramatically reduced fertility, high rates of infant mortality, compromised immune function, and a striking vulnerability to disease. Skin grafts between unrelated cheetahs are not rejected the way they would be between genetically diverse individuals because their immune systems are so similar they cannot tell the difference. The entire species is, in a very real biological sense, almost like a single organism replicated over and over again. Now ask yourself, what happens when you take a few hundred human beings, seal them inside a metal vessel, and ask them to maintain a healthy population for 1,000 years? A landmark study published in the journal Acta Astronautica, and this is real, peer-reviewed, published science, attempted to model exactly this scenario. The researchers, led by anthropologist Cameron Smith from Portland State University, used population genetics modeling to determine the minimum viable founding population for a multi-generational interstellar voyage. Their findings were striking. They concluded that to maintain sufficient genetic diversity throughout a journey of 200 years, not 1,000, not 500, but just 200, you would need a minimum starting population of somewhere between 14,000 and 40,000 individuals. 14,000 at the low end, if everything goes reasonably well. 40,000 as a more robust buffer against unexpected disasters, disease outbreaks, accidents, a bad run of years for fertility rates. These are not comfortable numbers. They do not describe a sleek, intimate crew of hand-picked specialists. They describe a city, a floating, moving, self-contained city, traveling between the stars. Later refinements of the model brought the minimum number down somewhat. Some researchers argue that with careful management of genetic diversity through practices like sperm and egg banking, embryo storage, and deliberate breeding program oversight, you might be able to sustain a healthy population from a smaller founding group, perhaps a few thousand individuals. But even the most optimistic estimates carry serious caveats. Genetic banking only works if the stored biological material survives the voyage, and we will come back to why that is not guaranteed. And deliberate population management raises ethical questions that are genuinely uncomfortable, questions about autonomy, about who decides who reproduces with whom, about what it means to make those choices on behalf of people who were born into a situation they never chose. But there is another layer to the genetic problem, one that is separate from inbreeding and in some ways even more insidious. It is called genetic drift. Even in a population that is carefully managed to avoid inbreeding, even one with thousands of members, random chance plays a role in which genes get passed on and which ones fade out. In a large population, these random fluctuations average out over time. But in a small, isolated population, one that cannot draw from any outside gene pool, those random fluctuations can have enormous consequences. Beneficial variants can be lost by pure accident, not because they were selected against, but simply because the individuals who carried them happened not to reproduce, or happened to be among those killed in a shipboard accident, or happened to carry that variant in a recessive form that never expressed. And harmful variants can spread, again purely by chance, simply because the individual who carried them happened to be in the right place at the right time to have many children. Over hundreds of generations, genetic drift can reshape a population's biology in ways that have nothing to do with adaptation or fitness. The descendants of your founding crew might emerge at their destination as a genetically impoverished population, not sick in any obvious way, not visibly struggling, but carrying a narrowed range of immune responses, a reduced capacity to adapt to novel diseases, a biological brittleness that might only become apparent when they finally step onto a new world and encounter microbes their immune systems have never been shaped to deal with. And here is the part that I find most haunting about all of this. There would be no way to know it was happening. There is no alarm that sounds when genetic diversity drops below a critical threshold. No display on the ship's bridge that says, "Warning, your descendants are becoming genetically vulnerable." The process unfolds invisibly, written in molecules too small to see, unfolding across timescales too long for any individual to perceive. The people living through it would have no idea. They would go about their lives, eating, sleeping, working, loving, raising their children, completely unaware that something fundamental was quietly changing in the biological fabric of their community. Now, scientists and engineers working on generationship concepts are not ignoring this problem. Far from it. One of the most actively discussed potential solutions involves carrying what is essentially a genetic library alongside the living crew, stored sperm, eggs, and embryos, cryogenically preserved, representing a far larger and more diverse genetic sample than the living population alone could provide. Some proposals go further, suggesting the storage of synthetic DNA sequences or even the digital encoding of complete human genomes that could theoretically be synthesized and expressed at the destination using biotechnology. This is not science fiction. Technologies like artificial wombs, technically called ectogenesis, are advancing rapidly. Research labs have already demonstrated the ability to gestate animal embryos outside a biological mother's body for significant periods of time. The science is moving quickly. Whether it will be mature enough, reliable enough, and ethically acceptable enough to deploy on an interstellar voyage is a different question, but the conceptual framework is real and the research is active. There is also a proposal that some researchers take quite seriously, carrying not just human genetic material, but a comprehensive biobank of Earth life, microbial cultures, plant seeds, animal cell lines as a kind of biological insurance policy, not just for the humans, but for whatever ecosystem they might eventually try to establish at their destination. Because the crew of a generation ship would not just be carrying themselves into the dark. If humanity ever sends a vessel like this, it would be carrying, in some sense, the living legacy of an entire biosphere, the only copy, or at least one very precious copy, of millions of years of terrestrial evolution. That framing shifts something in how you think about the mission, I think. It stops being purely an adventure story about human ambition and starts feeling more like an act of cosmic stewardship, or perhaps of cosmic vulnerability. But genetics is just one of the biological challenges. Because even if you solve the population size problem, even if you manage to preserve sufficient genetic diversity across the full length of the voyage, there is a second biological threat waiting for every person on that ship, every single day of their lives, from the moment the vessel clears the edge of the solar system. And unlike genetic drift, this one does not unfold slowly and invisibly over generations. This one starts working on you immediately, from the inside out. It is radiation, and it is one of the most serious, most well-documented, and least solvable problems in all of deep space travel. The kind of radiation that exists in the interstellar medium far beyond the protective bubble of our sun's magnetic field, a region called the heliosphere, is fundamentally different in character and intensity from anything we deal with on Earth's surface. On Earth, our planet's magnetic field and thick atmosphere absorb and deflect the vast majority of high-energy cosmic rays before they reach us. In low Earth orbit, astronauts on the International Space Station still receive roughly 10 times more radiation than people on the ground, and their mission durations are carefully limited because of it. In deep space, genuinely deep space, far from any star, that protection is gone almost entirely. We actually have real data on this, not just theoretical models. NASA's Curiosity rover, on its journey from Earth to Mars, carried a radiation detection instrument called the Radiation Assessment Detector. The data it collected during that cruise phase, about 8 months of interplanetary travel, showed that a crewed mission to Mars and back would expose astronauts to a radiation dose approaching the lifetime limit that NASA currently sets for its astronauts. And Mars is still inside our solar system. Mars is practically our next-door neighbor compared to where a generation ship would be going. In the interstellar medium, the primary concern is what are called galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles, mostly protons and heavier atomic nuclei, accelerated to enormous velocities by distant supernovae and other violent astrophysical events. These particles are not like X-rays or gamma rays. They are not electromagnetic waves. They are actual matter, moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. And when they slam into biological tissue, they do not just ionize atoms the way ordinary radiation does. They tear through cells like tiny but devastating bullets, leaving tracks of damage that can span dozens or even hundreds of cells in a single pass. The DNA strand breaks they cause are some of the most difficult for cellular repair machinery to fix accurately. The errors that slip through that repair process, the mutations, are cumulative. They build up over time. And over a lifetime of exposure, they dramatically increase the risk of cancer, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. There is also something even more alarming that NASA researchers have been studying carefully since the Apollo era: the effect of high-energy cosmic rays on the central nervous system. Studies in animal models, including research conducted specifically to inform deep space mission planning, have shown that exposure to the kind of heavy ion radiation present in deep space can cause measurable cognitive impairment, memory problems, reduced decision-making ability, anxiety-like behavior. The particles pass through the skull and through the neurons of the brain, and the damage they leave behind is not always reversible. For a crew that needs to remain cognitively sharp, capable of solving complex problems, making critical decisions, maintaining the ship's systems, over the course of centuries, this is not a trivial concern. It is existential. So what do you do about it? How do you shield a living crew from something that penetrating for that long? The most straightforward answer, thick shielding, runs immediately into a brutal engineering constraint. The heavier your shielding material, the more mass your ship carries. The more mass your ship carries, the more energy you need to accelerate it. The more energy you need, the larger and more complex your propulsion system becomes. The larger and more complex your propulsion system, the more mass it adds. You see the problem. It is a spiral. Every solution creates a new version of the same constraint. And the particularly cruel irony is that some shielding materials, particularly those that are high in hydrogen, like water or polyethylene, which are among the most effective at stopping cosmic rays, are also among the heaviest and most logistically demanding to carry in the quantities you would actually need. One concept that researchers have explored is the idea of using the ship's water supply as radiation shielding, essentially lining the walls of the crew's living quarters with water tanks, so that the hydrogen in the water absorbs incoming cosmic rays before they reach the people inside. This is elegant in its dual purpose. The water is there anyway for drinking, agriculture, and hygiene, so you are not carrying dead weight purely for shielding. But the geometry of this becomes complicated quickly, and water alone cannot stop the most energetic cosmic ray particles. Some of the most fascinating theoretical proposals involve magnetic shielding, generating an artificial magnetic field around the ship similar to the one that protects Earth to deflect charged particles before they even reach the hull. The physics is sound in principle. The technology, at the scale and intensity required, is not yet within our engineering grasp, but it is being researched. The European Space Agency has supported theoretical work in this area. NASA has explored it. It is not a closed door, but it is a very heavy one that we have barely begun to push. And then there is the most sobering possibility of all. That for a journey of hundreds or thousands of years, no shielding solution will be good enough to fully protect the crew, that the radiation will be a constant, low-grade presence in their lives, managed, mitigated, but never eliminated. A slow tax on their health, paid in increments too small to feel on any given day, but accumulating across a lifetime into something real and serious. If that is the reality, then the question stops being, how do we block the radiation? And starts being, how do we build a medical system capable of detecting and treating radiation-related illness in a closed, resource-limited environment continuously for 1,000 years without any outside help? And that question, that deeply human, deeply practical question, leads us somewhere we have not gone yet. Somewhere that might be the most complex frontier of all in Generationship science. Because we have talked about genetics, we have talked about radiation. Both of those are biological challenges, real, serious, and not yet solved. But the challenge I want to get into next is the one that, when I dug into the research, genuinely gave me pause. It is the one that the most thoughtful scientists working in this space keep coming back to, almost despite themselves, because it is the hardest to quantify. It is the hardest to model, and it is in the end the most human of all the problems. What happens to a society, a real, living, breathing human society, when it is sealed inside a closed environment and told that it must function, cooperate, maintain purpose, and remain psychologically coherent not just for one lifetime, but for dozens? What happens to culture, to memory, to motivation, to meaning? What happens when the mission the original crew signed up for, the mission they believed in with their whole hearts, becomes, for the people born 300 years later, not an adventure, not a calling, but simply the condition of their existence. Something they never chose, that they cannot leave, that defines everything about their lives, whether they want it to or not. Because here is the open loop I want to leave with you before we get there. There is a concept in sociology and social psychology called generational mission drift. And when you apply it to the specific conditions of a multi-generational spacecraft, the isolation, the limited population, the unchanging environment, the absolute absence of outside cultural input, what it predicts is something that makes the genetics problem look almost manageable by comparison. We are going into that next. There is a thought experiment I want you to sit with for a moment. Imagine you are 23 years old. You have grown up on this ship. You have never seen a sky, never felt rain on your skin, never stood on ground that did not hum faintly beneath your feet from the vibration of machinery running somewhere below you. You have seen images of Earth, of course. Everyone on board has. There are archives, photographs, videos, oral histories passed down from the original crew, recorded and catalogued and stored on servers that the ship's librarians maintain with quiet, careful devotion. You know what a forest looks like. You know what an ocean smells like. In the abstract, the way you know what a word means when you have only ever read it and never heard it spoken aloud, but you have never been there, and you never will be. Earth is not your home. It is your mythology. Now someone, a teacher, a commander, an elder, whoever holds authority in the community you were born into, sits you down and explains your purpose. They tell you that everything on this ship, every resource, every joule of energy, every kilogram of food grown in the hydroponic bays, every breath of recycled air, all of it exists in service of a single mission. A mission that was decided before your parents were born. A mission that will not be completed until long after you are dead. Your job, your reason for existing, as far as the mission is concerned, is to live well, reproduce responsibly, maintain your assigned systems, and pass the ship on to the next generation in at least as good a condition as you received it. And here is the question I want you to sit with. How do you feel about that? This is not a hypothetical that researchers just wave away. It is one of the central concerns in the serious academic literature on multi-generational space travel. And the word that keeps appearing in that literature, the concept that keeps coming up in papers by psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and ethicists, is legitimacy. Specifically, the question of whether a mission conceived and launched by one generation can retain its legitimacy, its moral authority, its motivational power, its social cohesion across the many generations that follow. Because here is what we know about human beings from history, from psychology, from sociology. We are not very good at sustained, multi-generational commitment to abstract goals. We are remarkable at short-term sacrifice for immediate survival. We are capable of extraordinary devotion to causes we personally believe in, especially when those causes are connected to community, identity, and shared experience. But ask a group of people to dedicate their entire lives, and implicitly the lives of their children and grandchildren, to a goal that none of them will ever see completed, in conditions of total isolation, with no possibility of exit or descent, and the psychological dynamics that emerge are complicated, deeply, genuinely complicated. The sociologist and space humanities scholar Cass Schroeder has written about what she calls the problem of the middle generations. The founding crew, the ones who chose to go, who felt the excitement of departure, who carried the mission in their bones as a personal calling. They are fine, at least in terms of motivation. They signed up, they believed. The final generations, the ones close enough to the destination to feel its pull, to grow up knowing that they might actually be among the arrivals, they too have something to hold on to, a tangible horizon, a reason that feels real and near. But the people in the middle, The generations born into the long, featureless stretch of the journey when Earth is unreachably far behind and the destination star is still only a distant point of light centuries ahead. What do they have? What is their story? What makes the constraints of their existence feel meaningful rather than merely imprisoning? History gives us some uncomfortable reference points here, not perfect analogies, but instructive ones. Consider the experience of isolated human communities throughout history: island populations, Arctic settlements, remote monastery communities that maintained themselves over long periods in conditions of restricted contact with the outside world. The patterns that emerge in these communities are remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. Strong internal social hierarchies develop. Rigid traditions form and calcify, because in an isolated community, tradition becomes one of the primary mechanisms for transmitting knowledge and maintaining social order. Deviation from those traditions starts to feel genuinely threatening, because in a small, closed community, social disruption has consequences that can ripple through the entire group. And over time, the community's identity, the story it tells itself about who it is and why it matters, tends to drift from the original founding purpose towards something more inward-looking, more mythologized, more focused on internal relationships and local meaning than on any distant external goal. Now transpose that onto a generationship, a community of perhaps several thousand people sealed inside a finite space, cut off from all outside cultural input, completely dependent on internal social stability for physical survival. The pressures toward conformity would be immense. The cost of social fracture, of serious internal conflict, would be existential in a very literal sense. A civil war on a generation ship is not a political crisis, it is a life support crisis. When the people responsible for maintaining the air recycling systems stop cooperating with the people responsible for growing the food, everyone dies. The stakes of social cohesion are not abstract on a generation ship. They are as concrete and immediate as the oxygen you are breathing. And yet, and this is the tension that makes the problem so genuinely difficult, human beings do not thrive under conditions of total conformity and zero autonomy either. We know this. It is one of the most well-replicated findings in all of psychology. Autonomy, the sense that you have meaningful choices in your own life, that you are not simply a cog in a machine whose purpose was decided before you were born, is one of the foundational requirements for psychological well-being. Strip it away, and what you get is not a smoothly functioning society. What you get is resentment, depression, apathy, the quiet erosion of the will to participate. There is a name for the destination of that erosion, and it appears in the generationship literature with disturbing frequency. Researchers call it mission abandonment, not a dramatic mutiny, not a violent overthrow of the ship's command structure, though those scenarios get discussed too. Mission abandonment is something quieter and more insidious. It is the gradual, collective decision, made by no one in particular, emerging from the cumulative choices of thousands of individuals across dozens of generations to stop caring about the destination, to stop orienting the community's values, resources, and energy toward the original goal of arrival, and to instead simply live, to turn the ship into a world unto itself, to let the mission become mythology, and mythology become legend, and legend become the kind of story people tell their children at bedtime without really believing it anymore. This is not speculative. We have a real-world analogue, and it is one of the most fascinating and melancholy stories in human history. Around 3,000 years ago, a seafaring people, almost certainly originating from what is now Taiwan, began one of the most extraordinary migrations in human history, sailing outrigger canoes across the open Pacific, navigating by stars and ocean swells and the flight patterns of birds. They island hopped across the largest ocean on Earth, eventually settling almost every habitable island across a vast triangle stretching from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest to Easter Island in the east. This was the Polynesian expansion, and it represents a level of sustained multi-generational maritime exploration that has no parallel in human history. But here is what happened on some of those islands after the initial settlement. The navigational knowledge, the extraordinary, hard-won understanding of ocean currents and star paths and weather patterns that had carried those first settlers across thousands of kilometers of open water was lost, not destroyed, not suppressed, simply forgotten. On some islands, the canoe-building traditions faded. The knowledge of how to construct deep-sea vessels and the cultural memory of why you would want to gradually dissolved into the daily life of communities that had understandably come to think of themselves as islanders rather than voyagers. The destination had been reached, the journey was over, and the skills and motivations of the journey did not survive the transition to settlement. Now imagine that same process of cultural forgetting playing out not on a tropical island with abundant resources and a warm sun overhead, but on a spacecraft hurtling through the dark between stars, where the forgotten knowledge is not ocean navigation but the maintenance protocols for the ship's radiation shielding systems, or the procedures for managing a bacterial outbreak in the hydroponic bays, or the engineering knowledge required to repair a fault in the water recycling plant. The stakes of cultural forgetting on a generation ship are not merely sentimental, they are survival critical. Every piece of technical knowledge that is lost, every procedure, every understanding, every hard-won lesson from the ship's earlier generations represents a potential catastrophic vulnerability waiting for its moment to emerge. This is why some of the most interesting proposals for generation ship design are not engineering proposals at all. They are cultural ones, educational ones, sociological ones. They concern not how to build the ship, but how to build the society that will live inside it. One of the most discussed ideas is the concept of the sacred text, a structured, comprehensive body of knowledge encoded in a format that is simultaneously accessible and authoritative, that the ship's community is educated to treat as foundational to their identity. Not a religious text in the traditional sense, though the parallels are obvious and acknowledged, but a technical and cultural document that carries the full weight of the mission's history, purpose, and practical requirements. Something that every child learns, that every adult knows, that the community's rituals and ceremonies reinforce, so that the knowledge does not live only in databanks that someone needs to remember to consult, but in the living memory and cultural identity of the people themselves. The challenge, of course, is that you are essentially designing a religion, or at least a quasi-religious tradition, and religious traditions, even the most carefully designed ones, have a way of evolving over time, of being reinterpreted, of having their original practical content gradually displaced by ritual and symbol that preserves the form while losing the substance. The Mass is still said, but the congregation no longer understands Latin. The ceremony is still performed, but no one quite remembers what it was originally for. Other proposals focus on education systems, on designing a curriculum so comprehensive and so deeply embedded in the ship's daily life that technical and scientific literacy is not optional, not a specialization, but a basic expectation of citizenship. Every person on the ship would be educated in the fundamentals of its critical systems, not at an engineering level necessarily, but enough to recognize when something is wrong, enough to understand why certain rules exist, enough to feel personally invested in the maintenance of the vessel as a shared project, rather than someone else's responsibility. And some researchers focus on something even more fundamental, the question of purpose itself, of meaning, of what it is that makes a human life feel worthwhile, and how you cultivate that sense of worth in conditions that are, by any objective measure, radically constrained. Because a person who feels that their life has meaning, who understands their role in a larger story, who feels connected to something beyond their own individual existence, is far more likely to maintain the behaviors that keep the ship alive than a person who feels trapped, purposeless, and forgotten by history. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote one of the most profound books about human resilience ever put to paper, argued that the capacity to find meaning in suffering, to locate purpose even in conditions of extreme constraint and deprivation, is one of the most distinctly human abilities we possess. His framework, which he called logotherapy, was built on the observation that the prisoners most likely to survive the camps were not always the physically strongest or the most practically resourceful. They were often the ones who had found or maintained a reason to survive, a purpose, a story about themselves that made their continued existence feel necessary and meaningful. I think about that observation a lot when I think about generationships. Because in a very real sense, the people on a multi-generational spacecraft would be living in conditions that rhyme in disturbing ways with extreme confinement and constrained autonomy. Not the same, obviously. Not concentration camps, but isolated, constrained, unable to leave, asked to endure not for months but for lifetimes, and to ask their children and their children's children to do the same. The psychological literature on long-duration confinement, from polar expeditions, from submarine deployments, from cave isolation studies, from simulations like the Mars 500 experiment, which had 6 volunteers live in a sealed habitat for 520 days to simulate a Mars mission, is clear on one point above all others. Meaning and purpose are not luxuries in those conditions. They are survival requirements. In the Mars 500 study, conducted jointly by the European Space Agency and the Russian Institute of Biomedical Problems, some participants developed significant sleep disruption, reduced physical activity, and psychological withdrawal as the simulation progressed. Not because conditions were physically dangerous, but because the psychological weight of sustained confinement and monotony pressed down on them in ways that were surprisingly hard to counteract, even over a period of less than 2 years. Now extend that pressure not to 520 days, but to 500 years, and understand that there is no debriefing at the end, no door that opens, no return to the world outside. And yet, and I want to be clear about this, because I do not think the story is simply bleak. Human beings have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to build rich, meaningful, coherent lives inside radically constrained circumstances. Monastic communities have sustained themselves in isolated, rule-bound environments for centuries. Indigenous communities have maintained cultural continuity and deep meaning across thousands of years in challenging environments. The human capacity for creating community, for building culture, for finding beauty and joy and purpose within limits, that capacity is real and it is profound. The question is not whether human beings can sustain a meaningful society in the conditions of a generationship. History suggests they can, at least in principle. The question is whether we are smart enough, careful enough, wise enough to design the social, cultural, and institutional structures that give them the best possible chance of doing so. Whether we can build not just a ship, but a civilization, small, enclosed, precious, hurtling through the dark, that remains fundamentally healthy across the whole unimaginable length of the journey. And that question, the design question, the civilization question, leads us directly into the part of the generationship problem that I find most technically fascinating. Because we have been talking largely about human factors, about biology and psychology and sociology, But there is an entire other dimension to the survival question that is purely physical, purely mechanical, purely about the physics and engineering of a vessel that has to operate in deep space for centuries. And some of what the science reveals about that challenge is genuinely startling in ways you might not expect. Because here is the open loop I want to leave you with before we move on. There is a particular problem in deep space engineering, one that does not get much attention in the popular conversation about interstellar travel, that some physicists and materials scientists consider potentially the single greatest physical obstacle to a generation ship's survival. It is not the propulsion system, as daunting as that challenge is. It is not the radiation shielding, as serious as we have established that to be. It is something you would almost certainly not think of if I asked you to list the engineering challenges of deep space travel. Something quiet and patient and utterly relentless. Something that has been working on every material object in the universe since the beginning of time, and that would be working on your ship every single moment of every single day of the entire voyage. And the truly sobering part? We do not yet fully understand how to stop it. That is what we get into next. The deep physics of long-duration space survival and why the universe itself, in a very real sense, is working against you. If you are enjoying this journey, make sure to give this video a like. Every single week, we go deep into the universe's biggest mysteries, grounded in real science, told in a way that actually makes you feel something. There is a law built into the fabric of the universe itself, not a law that humans wrote, not a regulation or a guideline or a policy that some governing body decided upon and could in principle change, a genuine, fundamental, inescapable law of physics, one that applies to every object in existence, every star, every planet, every galaxy, every structure of any kind, anywhere in the cosmos. And it is working against your generation ship every single second of every single day of the entire voyage, without pause, without mercy, and without any possibility of negotiation. It is called the second law of thermodynamics, and its most famous consequence, the one that matters most for our purposes, is a concept called entropy. You have probably heard the word. It gets used loosely in everyday language to mean something like disorder or decay or the general tendency of things to fall apart, and that intuition is actually not far from the physics. Entropy, in the thermodynamic sense, is a measure of disorder in a system, and the second law states, with the full authority of every experiment ever conducted in the history of physics, that in any closed system, any system that does not receive energy from outside, entropy always increases over time. Things do not spontaneously become more ordered. They become less ordered. They degrade. They break down. They spread out and mix and lose the structured organization that makes them useful. Your generation ship is, almost by definition, a closed system, or as close to one as anything humanity has ever built. It cannot pull in fresh materials from outside. It cannot receive replacement parts from a factory on Earth. Every component it launches with, every pipe, every seal, every bearing, every microchip, every structural weld, every polymer gasket, every optical lens, is the component it has for the entire journey, and entropy is working on all of them, all the time, without stopping. This is not a design flaw you can engineer away. It is the universe doing what the universe does. Now, you might think reasonably that this is just a more dramatic way of saying that things wear out. And yes, things do wear out. But I want to go deeper than that, because the specific ways that materials degrade in the deep space environment are different from the ways they degrade on Earth. And some of those differences are profoundly important for the survival of a multi-generational vessel. Let us start with something called metal fatigue. It is one of the most well-understood failure mechanisms in all of engineering, and it has brought down aircraft, collapsed bridges, and ruptured pipelines throughout the history of industrial civilization. Metal fatigue occurs when a material is subjected to repeated cycles of stress, loading and unloading, flexing and relaxing over a long period of time. Even stresses far below the level that would cause immediate failure can, over millions of cycles, initiate tiny cracks at the microscopic level. Those cracks grow, slowly invisibly, far below the surface of the material where visual inspection cannot catch them. And then, one day, seemingly without warning, the crack reaches a critical size, propagates rapidly through the remaining material, and the component fails, sometimes catastrophically. On a spacecraft, metal fatigue is a constant concern. Every time the ship's structure experiences a vibration, from the propulsion system, from internal machinery, from the thermal expansion and contraction caused by moving in and out of sunlight, it is accumulating fatigue cycles. Over decades, that accumulation becomes significant. Over centuries, it becomes something that no materials scientist on Earth has ever had to design around before, because we have simply never built a structure that needed to last that long in a dynamic loading environment. The engineering community has response strategies for fatigue, inspection regimes, conservative design margins, periodic component replacement. But all of those strategies assume access to replacement components and the ability to perform inspections on every part of the structure. On a generation ship, some structural components will simply be inaccessible, buried in walls, embedded in load-bearing sections that cannot be removed without compromising the ship's integrity. And replacement components can only come from whatever manufacturing capability the ship carries with it, which means the ship needs to be, in effect, its own factory, its own materials science laboratory, its own metallurgy facility, its own supply chain, sourcing raw materials from somewhere, processing them, fabricating them into usable parts, and doing all of this continuously for centuries without the industrial infrastructure of a planetary civilization to draw on. Then there is a failure mechanism that is specific to the space environment, and that is significantly more severe in deep space than in Earth orbit or even on interplanetary missions. It is called radiation embrittlement, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Sustained exposure to high-energy radiation, the same cosmic rays we discussed in the context of biological damage to the crew, also affects the materials the ship is built from. Over time, radiation bombardment alters the crystalline structure of metals and alloys at the atomic level, displacing atoms from their lattice positions and creating what materials scientists call radiation damage cascades. The result is a gradual change in the material's mechanical properties. It becomes harder but more brittle. Its resistance to crack propagation decreases. Its fatigue life shortens. And this process is cumulative and irreversible. You cannot unirradiate a piece of steel. Once the damage is done, it is done. Polymers, plastics, rubbers, sealants, adhesives are generally even more susceptible to radiation damage than metals. The long-chain molecular structures that give polymers their useful properties are disrupted by radiation, causing them to become brittle, to crack, to lose their elasticity, to fail in ways that can be subtle at first and then suddenly catastrophic. Every rubber gasket on a generation ship, every polymer seal, every adhesive joint, every plastic housing around a sensitive instrument, all of these are being degraded continuously by the radiation environment outside and inside the ship. The electronics are vulnerable too. Single event upsets, the corruption of data stored in electronic memory by a single high-energy particle passing through a chip, are a well-documented phenomenon in spacecraft engineering. Modern space-rated electronics are designed with radiation hardening measures to reduce this risk, but hardening adds mass and cost, and no amount of hardening provides perfect protection against the cosmic ray energies present in the deep interstellar medium. Over centuries, the cumulative effect of radiation on electronic systems, from single-event upsets to total ionizing dose effects that gradually degrade transistor performance, represents a serious design challenge that has no fully satisfying solution. But perhaps the most underappreciated material threat to a long-duration spacecraft is something that sounds almost mundane compared to radiation and metal fatigue. It is outgassing. Every material, every metal, every polymer, every composite, every adhesive, every coating releases trace amounts of volatile compounds in the vacuum of space. This process begins the moment the material is first exposed to vacuum, and it continues for years, sometimes decades. Most of it happens early in the mission, as the most volatile compounds are released quickly. But some materials continue to outgas at measurable rates for extraordinarily long periods. In the enclosed environment of a crewed spacecraft, outgassing matters enormously for air quality. The compounds released can include everything from water vapor to complex organic molecules to genuinely toxic substances. Managing the atmosphere of a closed vessel, maintaining not just the right balance of oxygen and nitrogen, but controlling the levels of carbon dioxide, trace contaminants, humidity, and the products of outgassing from materials throughout the ship, is one of the most technically demanding aspects of life support engineering. On the International Space Station, which has been continuously inhabited since the year 2000, atmospheric management is a constant, active process. The station's environmental control systems run continuously and require regular maintenance and component replacement. Filters get clogged, sensors drift out of calibration, pumps wear out, membranes degrade. Now stretch that challenge from 25 years, roughly the age of continuous habitation on the International Space Station, to 500 or 1,000. Every component in the environmental control system has a finite lifespan. Every filter needs to be replaced or regenerated or manufactured from scratch using onboard resources. Every sensor needs to be recalibrated or replaced. Every pump needs its bearings replaced, its seals renewed, its impeller cleaned of the biological fouling that inevitably accumulates in any system that handles water and air in a biologically active environment. The International Space Station is kept alive by a continuous pipeline of replacement parts and consumables launched from Earth. Without that pipeline, experts estimate it would begin to encounter serious system failures within a matter of years. A Generationship has no such pipeline. And this brings us to a concept that researchers working on closed ecological life support, the science of keeping people alive in fully sealed environments, consider absolutely fundamental to any realistic generation ship design. It is the idea of circular resource flows, or to put it in terms that are a bit more vivid, on a generation ship nothing can be wasted, ever. Not water, not air, not nutrients, not heat, not the organic matter in human waste, not the carbon dioxide you exhale, not the dead plant material from the agricultural systems. Every single atom of every resource on that ship needs to cycle, not once, not twice, but continuously, for the entire duration of the voyage. Through closed loops that return it to a usable form. We actually have real research on this. The European Space Agency, NASA, and several academic institutions have been working on what they call closed-loop life support systems, or, in more technical language, bioregenerative life support systems, for decades. The most ambitious experiments in this area have taken place in facilities like Biosphere, a Soviet-era experimental closed ecosystem that ran in Krasnoyarsk, Siberia, through the 1970s and 80s, and the Melissa project, micro-ecological life support system alternative, which the European Space Agency has been developing since 1989 and continues to this day. The Melissa project is fascinating and worth understanding in some detail because it gives you a concrete sense of what a real, functional closed-loop life support system looks like. and of how difficult it is to actually achieve full closure. The project uses a series of interconnected compartments, each containing specific microorganisms or higher plants to process waste, produce food, recycle water, and regenerate atmosphere. Organic waste goes into a bioreactor populated with thermophilic bacteria that break it down. The output of that process feeds into another compartment where different microorganisms continue the decomposition. The nutrients released by this process feed into plant growth chambers, where crops like wheat, lettuce, and spirulina algae produce food and generate oxygen through photosynthesis. The water transpired by the plants is recovered and recycled, and the cycle continues. After more than 3 decades of research, Melissa has achieved impressive results. But it has not yet achieved full closure, meaning a completely self-sufficient loop that requires zero inputs from outside. Real biological systems are messy. They produce unexpected byproducts. They are sensitive to perturbations. Maintaining the delicate balance of a complex multi-compartment ecosystem, especially one that includes human beings and their unpredictable biological output, is an ongoing engineering and biological challenge, not a solved problem. The researchers at Melissa are honest about this. They are making real progress. But the gap between current capability and the kind of robust, fully closed, centuries-durable system that a generation ship would require is still significant. There is also a thermodynamic challenge that sits at a level even more fundamental than materials degradation or resource cycling. It is the question of where the ship gets its energy, because even in a perfectly closed loop, even if every atom of every resource is successfully recycled with 100% efficiency, which is physically impossible. But let us imagine it for a moment. You still need energy to run the loops, energy to power the fans and pumps and bioreactors, energy to grow the food under artificial lighting, energy to maintain atmospheric pressure, energy to keep the temperature regulated, energy to run the medical systems, the computers, the manufacturing equipment, the propulsion system. Energy, energy, energy. A continuous, unrelenting demand for energy that does not diminish over time. In the inner solar system, solar panels are a viable power source for spacecraft. The sun provides a generous, continuous, free supply of electromagnetic energy that photovoltaic cells can convert into electricity. But a generation ship is going somewhere the sun cannot reach. Beyond even the outermost planets, sunlight becomes too faint to be useful for power generation at any practical scale. In the interstellar medium, you are on your own. You need to carry your power source with you. The most commonly discussed option for long-duration deep space power is nuclear fission, the same physics that powers nuclear reactors on Earth. Fission reactors are energy-dense, long-lived, and can operate independently of sunlight. Space nuclear reactors are not new technology. The Soviet Union operated dozens of nuclear-powered satellites during the Cold War era. NASA has been developing a small fission power system called kilopower, now evolved into the Fission Surface Power Project, designed to provide reliable nuclear electricity for lunar and Mars missions. These are real, functioning systems, but scaling nuclear fission to power a vessel that needs to support thousands of people for centuries introduces challenges of a different order of magnitude. The reactor components, particularly the fuel rods, the control systems, and the heat exchangers, all have finite lifespans. Reactor fuel is consumed over time. Structural components within the reactor are subjected to the most intense radiation environment on the entire ship, right next to the fuel core, and they degrade accordingly. Managing a fission reactor in deep space, with no possibility of refueling or major component replacement for 500 years or more, is not a solved engineering problem. It is a frontier. Some researchers propose nuclear fusion as a more attractive long-term option. Fusion reactors produce energy by fusing light atomic nuclei just as the Sun does, and their fuel, isotopes of hydrogen, is abundant in the universe and could theoretically be collected from the interstellar medium as the ship travels. The concept of a ramjet that scoops up interstellar hydrogen for both fuel and propulsion was proposed by physicist Robert Bussard back in 1960, and it is an elegant idea. The problem is that the density of hydrogen in the interstellar medium is extraordinarily low, far too low, current calculations suggest, for a Bussard ramjet to work as originally envisioned. And fusion power itself, despite 70 years of research and billions of euros of investment, remains a technology that is always tantalizingly close to practical realization, but has not yet crossed the threshold into reliable, sustained net energy production at any useful scale. So when you add all of this together, the entropy working on every material component, the radiation embrittlement of structures and electronics, the challenge of closed-loop resource cycling, the thermodynamic demands of long-duration power generation, you get a picture of engineering complexity that is genuinely humbling. Every solution requires energy. Every energy source has finite lifetime. Every material degrades. Every system eventually fails. And the only thing standing between the people inside and the void outside is the collective ability of those people to understand, maintain, repair, and when necessary rebuild the systems that keep them alive, which is why some of the most thoughtful proposals for Generationship design do not look like what you probably imagine when you picture a spacecraft. They do not look like a sleek, rigid vessel, a single engineered object launched from Earth and expected to hold together for 1,000 years. Instead, they look like something more organic, more adaptable, more alive. The concept is sometimes called a self-replicating ship or a living ship. The core idea is that instead of launching with a fixed inventory of components that will gradually wear out and cannot be replaced, you launch with the capacity to manufacture new components from raw materials. You carry not just tools, but the knowledge and equipment to make tools, not just parts, but the ability to fabricate parts, not just a ship, but a shipyard. This is where the concept of in-situ resource utilization, a term NASA uses in the context of using local planetary resources for construction and manufacturing on the Moon or Mars, gets extended to the interstellar context. A generation ship with robust manufacturing capability could, in principle, use asteroid material collected during the early part of the journey within the outer solar system before leaving the heliosphere entirely to build up a reserve of raw metals and minerals. It could use onboard three-dimensional printing and more advanced fabrication technologies to produce replacement components on demand. It could maintain not just a library of knowledge, but a working industrial base capable of producing whatever the mission needs. As the need arises, this is enormously ambitious. The manufacturing capability required would be vast. The knowledge base required to operate it, metallurgy, materials science, electronics fabrication, mechanical engineering, across all the disciplines simultaneously, would have to be maintained and transmitted across generations, never allowed to fade. But it is not physically impossible. It is a genuine engineering challenge, and some serious people are thinking about it seriously. There is one more physical challenge I want to raise before we move on, and it is one that connects the purely mechanical world of engineering to the biological world of the crew in a way that I find particularly striking. It has to do with what happens to the human body, not from radiation, which we covered earlier, but from something even more basic, something that affects astronauts even on short missions to the International Space Station, and that would be a continuous chronic factor in the lives of everyone born and raised on a generation ship, gravity. Or rather, the absence of it. The human body evolved over millions of years in a gravitational field of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. Our bones, our muscles, our cardiovascular system, our vestibular system, all of it is calibrated for that constant downward pull. Remove the pull, and the body begins to adapt in ways that are well documented but not well solved. Bone density decreases as the skeletal system is no longer required to support body weight. Muscle mass atrophies without the constant resistance of gravity. The cardiovascular system adapts to a fluid distribution that is more even throughout the body rather than the head-down loading imposed by gravity on Earth. And those adaptations cause their own suite of problems, including changes in intracranial pressure that can affect vision. Astronauts on the International Space Station experience all of these effects during missions that typically last 6 months. They counteract them with intensive daily exercise regimes, 2 hours per day of rigorous cardiovascular and resistance training every single day, and with careful nutritional management. And even so, bone density losses and muscle atrophy remain significant concerns, especially for longer missions, for the inhabitants of a generation ship spending their entire lives in zero gravity or near zero gravity. This is not a temporary inconvenience to be managed with exercise and then reversed after landing. It is the permanent condition of their existence. And the children born on the ship, if they develop in a zero-gravity or low-gravity environment, may develop physiologies that are fundamentally different from the humans who originally departed Earth, not just adapted, transformed, in ways that might make them better suited to life in space, but potentially less capable of functioning on the high-gravity surface of a new planet, which is theoretically the whole point of the journey. The standard engineering solution to this problem is artificial gravity, spinning some or all of the ship at a rate that generates centrifugal acceleration equivalent to Earth's gravity. The physics are well understood. A rotating structure of sufficient radius, spinning at the right angular velocity, creates an outward acceleration that is indistinguishable from gravity for the people inside it. This concept has been understood since at least the work of aerospace pioneer Hermann Oberth and rocket scientist Wernher von Braun in the mid-20th century. It appears in countless spacecraft designs, both fictional and serious. But implementing it on a generation ship introduces significant engineering complexities. The rotating section has to be large enough, the radius has to be sufficient to produce comfortable gravity without inducing dizziness from the Coriolis effect. It has to be mechanically connected to non-rotating sections of the ship in a way that allows the transfer of people and materials between them. The bearings and seals at the interface of rotating and non-rotating sections are among the highest wear components on the entire vessel, and they need to function reliably for centuries. And yet, for all those challenges, artificial gravity is probably not optional. The alternative is multi-generational bone loss and muscle atrophy in the living population, and potentially the physiological transformation of the crew's descendants into people who cannot stand up on a planet, which, again, somewhat undermines the purpose of the whole endeavor. So here is where we are, at the end of this part of our exploration. We have a vessel that needs to be built from materials that entropy and radiation are continuously degrading. It needs to carry its own energy source for centuries. It needs to maintain fully closed resource loops, air, water, nutrients, waste, with no external inputs. It needs to provide artificial gravity for its inhabitants. It needs to shield those inhabitants from cosmic radiation. It needs to maintain its own manufacturing and fabrication capability. And it needs to do all of this for a span of time longer than any complex engineered system in human history has ever been asked to operate. And yet, here is the thing that keeps pulling me back. Every time the scale of the challenge threatens to become simply overwhelming. Every one of these problems is real. Every one of them is serious. but not one of them is impossible in principle. The physics does not forbid any of it. The universe does not contain a law that says human beings cannot cross interstellar distances in multi-generational vessels. It contains only extraordinarily difficult engineering problems, and difficult engineering problems are what our species does. It is what we have always done. The history of human civilization is, in very large part, the history of people deciding that something that had never been done before was worth attempting, and then figuring out how. What I want to explore next is something that ties all of these threads together: the biology, the psychology, the sociology, and the engineering. Because there is a concept in Generationship design that addresses not just one of these challenges, but potentially all of them simultaneously. It is a design philosophy, or perhaps more accurately, a mission architecture that represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about what a generationship actually is. And it comes from a direction that surprises most people when they first encounter it. It does not come from aerospace engineering. It comes from ecology. There is a forest in Poland that has been standing for approximately 10,000 years. It is called Biosphere. It sits on the border between Poland and Belarus, and it is one of the last and largest remaining fragments of the primeval forest that once stretched across the entire European continent after the last ice age retreated. It has never been cleared, never been replanted, never been managed in the way that most modern forests are managed, with selective harvesting, pest control, and deliberate species introduction. It has simply been left to be itself, and what it has become over 10 millennia of uninterrupted ecological process is something that professional ecologists describe in language that sounds almost reverent. It is not just old trees. It is a system, a vast interlocking, mutually sustaining network of relationships between thousands of species of trees, fungi, bacteria, insects, birds, mammals, and microorganisms, all of them connected in ways that are still not fully understood, all of them contributing to a collective resilience that allows the forest to absorb disturbances, recover from damage, and continue functioning across timescales that dwarf any human institution. When a tree falls in Biosphere, it does not simply rot and disappear. It becomes a habitat, a nursery for fungi, a feeding ground for beetle larvae, a moisture reservoir that sustains mosses and lichens, a slow-release nutrient store that feeds the roots of neighboring trees for decades. The falling of one tree is, in a sense, the beginning of 100 other stories. Nothing is wasted, nothing is lost. Every death becomes a contribution to the continuing life of the system as a whole. I want you to hold that image, that ancient, self-sustaining, endlessly cycling living system, as we talk about what the most forward-thinking generationship designers are actually proposing. Because the most compelling visions for long-duration interstellar vessels are not engineering blueprints in the traditional sense. They are, at their core, attempts to replicate something like Biosphere, not a machine, a living system, one where the goal is not to prevent change and degradation, which the second law of thermodynamics guarantees is impossible, but to build something resilient enough and adaptive enough to persist and renew itself across the full span of the journey. The technical term for what we are talking about is a closed ecological life support system, sometimes abbreviated as CELS, but that clinical acronym does not quite capture what the most ambitious versions of this concept actually envision. The idea, at its fullest expression, is to build not just a life support system, but a genuine miniature biosphere, a self-contained slice of Earth's living complexity, transplanted into space and maintained not primarily by mechanical systems that will eventually fail, but by biological processes that have been refining themselves for 3.5 billion years and are, in a very real sense, far more robust and self-correcting than anything human engineers have ever built, Think about what Earth's biosphere actually does. It recycles every atom of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and every other biologically important element through continuous cycles of life, death, decomposition, and renewal. It generates its own atmospheric composition, maintaining the precise blend of gases that complex life requires. It regulates temperature through feedback loops that involve the oceans, the atmosphere, living organisms, and the geological processes of the planet's crust. It produces its own energy currency, the sugars generated by photosynthesis from nothing more than sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. It repairs damage. It adapts to perturbation. It evolves. Now, obviously, you cannot put the entire Earth biosphere inside a spacecraft. The Earth's biosphere is, among other things, sustained by the energy of a star, the buffering capacity of a global ocean, the chemical cycling capacity of a planetary-scale lithosphere, and the evolutionary experimentation of trillions upon trillions of organisms across billions of years. You cannot replicate that. But the question that researchers in closed ecological life support are genuinely asking is, how much of that complexity do you need to capture? What is the minimum viable biosphere, the smallest, simplest, most efficiently designed slice of Earth's living complexity that could sustain a human community indefinitely in deep space? And here is what the research suggests. The answer is not a simple hydroponic farm with a few varieties of lettuce and some algae tanks, appealing as that image might be in its tidiness. The answer is something significantly richer and more complex than that, something that feels less like a factory and more like a garden, or perhaps more like that ancient forest. The key concept is trophic complexity, the diversity of feeding relationships within an ecosystem. In a simple agricultural system, the kind you might imagine on a basic space station, you have a few crop species, some bacteria for waste decomposition, and humans at the top of the food chain. The system is efficient and controllable, but it is also brittle. Remove one species, disrupt one process, and the whole thing can cascade toward failure very quickly. There are not enough redundant pathways, not enough alternative routes for nutrients and energy to flow through, to absorb the loss. A more complex ecosystem, one with a richer food web, more diverse microbial communities, a wider variety of plant species, perhaps some invertebrate and small vertebrate species as well, is more robust precisely because of its complexity. If one species is lost or disrupted, others can partially fill its functional role. The system has buffers, redundancies, alternative pathways. It can absorb perturbation and recover. This is one of the fundamental insights of modern ecology, and it has direct implications for generationship design. The Melissa project, which we touched on in the previous part, is moving in this direction. Its later phases have incorporated increasingly complex biological communities, not just simple bacterial cultures and algae, but higher plants, more diverse microbial ecosystems, precisely because the research has confirmed what ecological theory predicts. More biological complexity yields more system stability, more resilience, a greater capacity to self-correct when something goes wrong. But if we are going to build a genuine miniature biosphere on a generation ship, we have to confront a question that is simultaneously practical and deeply philosophical. Which species do you take with you? Not just crops, not just the organisms that directly feed the humans on board. Which of the millions of species that make up Earth's biosphere do you consider essential to the system's long-term function? Because every species you include adds mass, adds complexity, adds the metabolic demands of that organism to the ship's resource budget. But every species you leave out is a functional role in the ecosystem that might be missed, sometimes in ways that are not immediately obvious. Here is a concrete example. Mycorrhizal fungi, the networks of fungal threads that form symbiotic relationships with the roots of most land plants. extending their effective root area enormously and facilitating the transfer of nutrients between plants and soil organisms, are invisible. You would not notice them if you walk through a garden, but remove them and the plants they support become dramatically less healthy, less productive, and more vulnerable to stress. The relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots is ancient. It dates back at least 450 million years to the earliest land plants, and it is one of the foundation stones of terrestrial plant ecology. If you build a Generationship's agricultural system without them, you have built an ecosystem with a missing pillar. And mycorrhizal fungi are just one example among thousands, soil bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can use. Decomposer organisms, bacteria, fungi, invertebrates, that break down dead organic matter and return its nutrients to the cycle. Pollinating insects, if you are growing plants that require pollination to produce fruit or seed. The gut microbiome, the trillions of microorganisms living inside every human digestive tract, without which human digestion, immune function, and even mental health are significantly impaired. Every one of these is a living component of the biosphere that the ship's human inhabitants depend on, often without realizing it. The concept of bringing a comprehensive biobank, not just human genetic material, as we discussed in an earlier part, but seeds, spores, bacterial cultures, fungal cultures, cryopreserved animal cells, and even preserved soil microbial communities from diverse Earth ecosystems is taken very seriously by researchers in this space. The Noah's Ark metaphor is almost irresistible, and in this context it is not entirely inappropriate. You would be loading a vessel with the living diversity of Earth, carefully selected, carefully preserved, carefully managed, and carrying it across the void to a new world. But here is a layer of this that I find particularly thought-provoking and that I do not think gets enough attention. The ecological model of the Generationship does not just change how we think about life support, it changes how we think about the relationship between the crew and the ship. It changes the fundamental character of life on board. In the purely mechanical model of a Generationship, the one where life support is a set of engineered systems that humans operate and maintain, the relationship between the crew and the ship is essentially that of operators to machines. The ship is a tool, the humans run it. Their job is to keep the tool working, and as we have discussed, that relationship extended across multiple generations can become psychologically corrosive. When the tool is your entire world, when there is nothing outside it, when its walls are the boundary of your existence, being its servant starts to feel less like a purpose and more like a sentence. But in the ecological model, where the ship contains a genuine living system, complex and dynamic, and requiring not just mechanical maintenance but genuine ecological stewardship, the relationship is fundamentally different. The crew are not just operators, they are participants in a living system. They are, in a meaningful sense, part of the ecosystem themselves. Their role is not just to keep machines running, but to tend a garden, to observe and understand a complex biological community, to make nuanced decisions about ecological balance, to notice when something is off and understand why, to see the system as something alive, something they belong to, not just something they maintain. That is a profoundly different psychological relationship. And the psychological literature on human connection to living systems, what the biologist E.O. Wilson called biophilia, our deep, evolved affinity for other living things, suggests that it matters enormously for well-being. Studies in everything from hospital recovery rates to prison behavior to urban mental health have consistently shown that access to living nature, plants, animals, soil, the sounds and smells of a living ecosystem, has measurable positive effects on human psychological health. In the isolated, constrained environment of a Generationship, those effects would not be a luxury. They would be part of the ship's life support system in the fullest sense of the term. There is a related concept that I want to bring in here because it connects the ecological model of the ship to the social and cultural questions we explored in the previous part. It is the idea of meaningful work, work that connects you to something larger than yourself, that requires genuine skill and knowledge, that produces visible results, and that the community around you recognizes as valuable. One of the quieter crises in modern industrial societies is the widespread sense, documented across numerous sociological studies, that many people's work is fundamentally disconnected from anything they can see, touch, or feel proud of. The abstraction of labor in complex economies, where your specific task is so far removed from any tangible output that it is difficult to feel that it matters, is associated with elevated rates of disengagement, depression, and what the anthropologist David Graeber memorably called bullshit jobs, positions that even the people occupying them privately acknowledge to serve no clear purpose. On a generation ship with a genuine living ecosystem, a ship that contains forests and gardens and biological communities that require active stewardship, almost no one is at risk of experiencing their work as disconnected from anything real. Every person on board would have a visible, tangible role in the maintenance of a living system that their survival depends on. The farmer who tends the wheat bays sees the grain grow. The ecologist who monitors the microbial balance of the composting system sees, in the health of the plants that the compost feeds, the direct result of their work. The doctor who maintains the crew's health sees their patients recover. The engineer who fixes the water recycler sees the clean water flowing. The teacher who transmits the accumulated knowledge of the voyage to the next generation sees that knowledge living on in the children they taught. This is not utopia. It is not a guarantee of happiness or fulfillment for every individual in every generation. Human beings are complex and varied, and the sources of their suffering are correspondingly complex and varied. But it is a social architecture that provides, at least structurally, the conditions that psychological research consistently identifies as prerequisites for human flourishing: meaningful work, clear social roles, connection to living systems, visible contribution to collective survival. Now, I want to introduce a concept that takes everything we have been building toward and pushes it one step further. Because the ecological model of the Generationship is compelling, but there is a more radical version of it that some researchers and space settlement theorists are actively exploring, and it is one that, in my view, represents the most honest confrontation with the full scale of what an interstellar journey would actually mean. It is called the world ship. Not a generation ship, a world ship. And the difference is not just one of scale, though scale is certainly part of it. The conceptual difference is more fundamental. A generation ship, even a large and ecologically rich one, is still fundamentally oriented toward a destination. It is a vessel in transit. Its purpose is the journey's end. The mission is arrival. A world ship is something else. A world ship is a vessel so large and designed with such genuine ecological and social completeness that it is not really a vessel in transit at all. It is a world, a civilization, a complete human society that happens to be moving through space. The destination, if it has one at all, and some world ship proposals do not, is almost secondary to the ongoing project of the ship itself. The life lived on board is not a sacrifice made in service of a future arrival. It is the point, it is the civilization, it is the human story continuing. The physicist and mathematician Freeman Dyson, one of the most creative and wide-ranging scientific minds of the 20th century, was one of the earliest serious thinkers about world ships. Dyson imagined vessels, kilometers, or even tens of kilometers in scale, carrying populations of hundreds of thousands or even millions, with interior spaces large enough to contain genuine climates, topographies, bodies of water, wild ecosystems alongside agricultural ones, not a spacecraft that happens to support human life, a world that happens to be capable of interstellar travel at that scale. Many of the problems we have been discussing begin to look different. Population genetics is no longer a crisis when your founding population is measured in the hundreds of thousands. Monoculture fragility in the ecosystem is no longer a concern when your agricultural system is embedded within a rich and diverse biosphere large enough to maintain genuine ecological complexity. The psychological problem of mission abandonment begins to dissolve when the mission is not really a mission anymore. It is just life. The civilization aboard is not sacrificing itself for a distant future. It is living its present. The engineering challenges of a world ship are obviously almost incomprehensible in their scale. We are talking about a structure that would make the International Space Station, already the largest object ever assembled in orbit, look like a wristwatch component. The materials required, the energy required to build it, let alone propel it, the timescales required for its construction in space, using robotic and human labor, probably over decades or centuries. All of this is far beyond our current capability. But here is what Dyson and the thinkers who have followed in his direction would say to that. Of course, it is beyond our current capability. So was every major step in human technological development, right up until it was not. The question is not whether we can build it today. The question is whether it is physically possible in principle, whether the laws of the universe permit it, and whether the goal is worthy of the effort of figuring out how. And the answer to both of those questions is yes. There is also a fascinating argument to be made that the world ship concept actually reduces overall risk compared to a smaller, more purpose-built generation ship precisely because of its scale and ecological richness. A world ship with a population of 1 million people and a diverse, complex biosphere is not betting its survival on a single point of failure. It has redundancy at every level: biological, social, technical, cultural. The loss of any single system, any single species, any single community or knowledge tradition does not threaten the whole. The system is large enough and complex enough to absorb significant damage and recover. It is, in the ecological sense we have been exploring, genuinely resilient. But here is the thread I want to pull on as we move toward the next part of our exploration. Because we have been assuming throughout most of this conversation something that I think deserves to be questioned directly, we have been assuming that a generation ship or a world ship would be traveling towards something, a destination, a specific star system with specific planets assessed from astronomical data as having some potential for human habitation or use. We have been assuming that the interstellar crossing is a means to an end, that the ship is a vehicle whose purpose is to deliver human beings from one place to another. But what if the destination is not what matters? What if the crossing itself, the long, strange, unprecedented human experience of living between the stars, changes the people involved in ways that we cannot predict from our comfortable vantage point on the surface of a warm, sunlit planet? What if the civilization that steps out at the far end of that journey is so different, culturally, philosophically, perhaps even biologically, from the one that stepped in at the beginning, that the concept of arrival stops meaning what we think it means, and there is an even deeper question underneath that one. A question that the latest findings in astronomy and astrophysics have sharpened considerably in recent years, because we now know with a level of confidence that was simply not available to previous generations that our galaxy contains an extraordinary abundance of planetary systems. The Kepler Space Telescope and its successor, TESS, the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, have revealed that planets are not rare exceptions scattered through an otherwise empty galaxy. They are the rule. Nearly every star we have examined closely appears to have planets, and the number of those planets that fall within what astronomers call the habitable zone, close enough to their star for liquid water to exist on the surface, but not so close that the heat destroys it, is, by current estimates, almost staggeringly large. The precise number is debated, but one estimate drawing on Kepler data suggested that our galaxy alone may contain something in the order of 40 billion Earth-sized planets in the habitable zones of their stars. 40 billion. In one galaxy out of the hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. Our galaxy, by the way, is entirely average, perhaps even on the smaller side. The universe, it appears, is genuinely saturated with the potential conditions for life. Now, potential conditions for life are very different from actual inhabited worlds, and we will come back to that distinction in a moment. But for the question of Generationship destinations, this abundance of potentially habitable worlds is enormously relevant. It means that a generation ship does not need to bet everything on a single target. It could, in principle, travel toward the nearest candidate system, assess it from close range for habitability, and if that system proves unsuitable, continue to the next one. The ship itself, if it is genuinely self-sustaining, does not need to arrive anywhere in particular. It needs to keep going until it finds somewhere worth stopping. That reframing from journey to a specific destination to ongoing expedition through a star-rich galaxy opens up a vision of interstellar civilization that is quite different from the one we usually imagine. And it connects to a question that has been sitting quietly underneath everything we have talked about today. A question that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the work of researchers at institutions like the SETI Institute in California, and the mathematical framework known as the Drake equation, forces us to confront honestly if interstellar travel is possible in principle, if the laws of physics permit it, if the engineering challenges can in principle be solved, then why, in a galaxy teeming with planetary systems and presumably teeming with the chemistry of life, do we see no evidence of civilizations that have done it? Why is the sky not filled with the signals of interstellar societies? Why, as the physicist Enrico Fermi famously asked over lunch in the summer of 1950, is nobody home? The Fermi paradox, the apparent contradiction between the vast number of potentially inhabited worlds in the galaxy and the complete absence of any detectable evidence of extraterrestrial civilization, has dozens of proposed resolutions, some optimistic, some deeply sobering, and one of the most sobering ones has everything to do with the question we have been asking today. It is called the Great Filter, and the possibility that it lies ahead of us, rather than behind us, is, in my view, one of the most important and underappreciated ideas in all of modern science. We are going to go there next, because the question of how long a generation ship could survive in deep space is ultimately a question that is much larger than engineering. It is a question about the long-term fate of intelligent civilizations, about whether the universe is a place that tends to produce stories with good endings, or whether the silence out there in the dark is telling us something we are not yet ready to hear. On a summer afternoon in 1950, 4 of the most brilliant physicists in the world sat down together for lunch at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. The conversation wandered, as conversations between great minds tend to do, from topic to topic, and at some point it turned to a cartoon that had recently appeared in a New York newspaper, depicting little green aliens stealing rubbish bins from New York City streets. Someone laughed, someone made a joke, and then one of the 4 men, a slight, intense Italian-American physicist named Enrico Fermi, who had already changed the world by building the first artificial nuclear reactor beneath the stands of a football stadium in Chicago, went quiet for a moment, and then he looked up and asked, with the kind of deceptive simplicity that only truly great scientists can manage, a question that has haunted physics, astronomy, philosophy, and the study of life in the universe ever since. But where is everybody? That was it. That was the whole question. 3 words and a name. The Fermi paradox. And in the 70-plus years since that lunch, despite the extraordinary expansion of our knowledge of the universe, despite the discovery of thousands of exoplanets, the detection of complex organic chemistry in interstellar space, the development of radio telescopes sensitive enough to detect a television broadcast from dozens of light years away, we have not found a single convincing answer to it. The sky remains silent. The galaxy, as far as our instruments can tell, is empty of anyone else's signals, and that silence, when you really sit with it, is one of the most profound and unsettling facts in all of science. Let us set the stage properly, because the scale of the paradox only becomes fully apparent when you appreciate the numbers involved. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. The current best estimate from astronomers, drawing on data from missions like the European Space Agency's Gaia satellite, which has mapped the positions and velocities of nearly 2 billion stars with extraordinary precision, sits toward the higher end of that range. Let us say roughly 250 billion stars, give or take. We now know, from the data returned by the Kepler Space Telescope before its retirement in 2018, that most of those stars host planetary systems. The statistics suggest that virtually every star in the galaxy has at least one planet orbiting it, and many have several. Among those planets, a significant fraction orbit within the habitable zone of their star, the range of distances where liquid water could exist on the surface. Estimates of the number of potentially Earth-like planets in the habitable zones of Milky Way stars range from the tens of billions to the hundreds of billions. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in your mind without them becoming abstract. Now add time. The Milky Way is approximately 13.6 billion years old, nearly as old as the universe itself. Earth, at 4.5 billion years old, is a relative newcomer. There are stars in our galaxy that formed and developed planetary systems billions of years before our sun even condensed from its natal cloud of gas and dust. If life arose on any of those earlier worlds, and if that life eventually developed intelligence and technology, those civilizations had a multi-billion-year head start on us. In the context of interstellar travel, even at the modest speeds we are talking about for generation ships, a fraction of a percent of the speed of light, a civilization that has been expanding for 1 billion years could have colonized the entire galaxy many times over. And yet nothing, no signals, no megastructures detectable by our telescopes, no evidence of planetary engineering on the scales that a genuinely advanced civilization might undertake, no von Neumann probes, the self-replicating robotic explorers that theorists have proposed as the most efficient means of galactic exploration detected in our solar system or anywhere else. The universe, at least within the range of our instruments, looks completely, utterly, bewilderingly uninhabited by anyone other than us. That is the Fermi paradox, and it is not a casual observation. It is one of the deepest unsolved problems in science. Dozens of proposed resolutions have been offered over the decades. Some of them are optimistic, some are chilling, and several of them have direct implications for the question at the heart of our exploration today. How long could a generation ship survive? In ways that I think are genuinely important to understand. The optimistic resolutions tend to cluster around what you might call the rarity argument. Perhaps intelligent life is simply extraordinarily rare. perhaps the chain of events required to produce a technological civilization, the right star, the right planetary system geometry, the right chemical conditions, the right sequence of evolutionary steps, the right combination of mass extinction events to drive adaptive radiation without wiping everything out entirely is so improbable that in a galaxy of 250 billion stars, it has only happened once, or a handful of times, in which case the silence is not surprising. We are alone or nearly so, and the galaxy simply has not had time to fill up with anyone else yet. This resolution is sometimes called the rare Earth hypothesis, after the influential book of the same name by paleontologist Peter Ward and astronomer Joe Kirschvink. Their argument, in essence, is that Earth is genuinely exceptional, not just in having life, but in having the specific suite of conditions that allowed complex, intelligent, technological life to develop. The presence of a large moon that stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, preventing the wild climate swings that would result from a wobbling rotational axis. The existence of Jupiter in the outer solar system, whose enormous gravity acts as a partial shield, deflecting or capturing many of the comets and asteroids that would otherwise bombard the inner planets far more frequently. The presence of plate tectonics, which cycles carbon through the atmosphere and regulates the planet's long-term climate in ways that a geologically dead world cannot. Each of these factors, Ward and Kirschvink argue, is individually improbable. Their combination in a single world may be extraordinarily so. The philosophical comfort of the rare Earth hypothesis is real. If we are alone or nearly alone in the galaxy, then the silence has an innocent explanation. There is no one else out there to hear from. The universe is waiting for us. The galaxy is ours to explore if we can find the means and the will. But there is another class of resolution to the Fermi paradox that is considerably less comfortable, and it is the one that has the most direct bearing on our discussion of generation ships. It centers on a concept introduced by economist Robin Hanson in 1998. He called it the Great Filter. The argument runs like this: for intelligent, technological civilizations to be absent from the observable galaxy, despite the vast number of potentially suitable worlds and the enormous age of the galaxy, something must be filtering them out. Some step in the development of life and civilization must be so difficult, so unlikely, or so dangerous that virtually no civilization makes it through successfully. The universe tries to produce technological civilizations over and over again across billions of worlds and billions of years, and something at some stage stops them, almost always, with near-perfect efficiency. Hansen called this the Great Filter because it filters out civilizations the way a coffee filter filters out grounds, allowing almost nothing through. And the question that makes this concept so significant and so potentially terrifying is, where in the developmental sequence does the filter sit? Is it behind us or ahead of us? If the filter is behind us, if the extraordinarily difficult step that civilizations almost never make it past is something we have already accomplished, then we might be genuinely exceptional. Perhaps the origin of life itself is the filter. Perhaps the chemistry of the first self-replicating molecule is so improbable that it almost never happens. Or perhaps the development of the eukaryotic cell, the complex nucleus-containing cell type that is the basis of all multicellular life, is the filter. Or the emergence of multicellular organisms. Or the evolution of intelligence. Each of these transitions happened only once in the known history of life on Earth, which at least raises the possibility that each one was extraordinarily improbable. If one of these is the Great Filter, if the hard step is already behind us, then the silence of the cosmos makes sense and our future is open. We are rare and precious, and the galaxy may genuinely be waiting for us. But if the filter is ahead of us, if civilizations routinely reach our current level of development, and then, almost without exception, fail to make it further, then the silence of the cosmos is not reassuring. It is a warning, a record of failure written in the absence of signals from 100 billion worlds that came close but did not make it. And in that case, whatever the filter is, whatever kills civilizations after they develop technology, we are approaching it. Perhaps we are already entering it. What could the filter be if it lies ahead of us? Researchers have proposed several candidates, and I want to walk through the ones that are most relevant to our conversation, because they map, in striking ways, onto the challenges we have been discussing. One candidate is self-destruction through technology, the development of weapons capable of civilization-ending damage, nuclear weapons being the most obvious current example, but conceivably biological weapons or technologies we cannot yet envision, creates a window of vulnerability in any technological civilization's development. The period between first developing these weapons and either destroying yourself with them or successfully governing them is potentially extremely narrow and extremely dangerous. We are living in that window right now. We have been since July 1945, when the first nuclear device was detonated in the desert of New Mexico. Whether humanity successfully navigates that window is one of the defining questions of our time. And if most civilizations do not navigate it successfully, if the average technological species tends to destroy itself within a few centuries of developing weapons of mass destruction, that would go a long way toward explaining the silence. Another candidate is resource exhaustion and ecological collapse. A technological civilization that develops industrial capacity before it develops the wisdom to sustain its planetary resources sustainably may simply consume its world to the point of civilizational collapse before it ever develops the capability for interstellar travel. The timescales involved are uncomfortably relevant to our own situation. But here is the candidate great filter that I find most directly connected to the Generationship question. It is one that does not get as much attention as nuclear war or ecological collapse, perhaps because it is less dramatic in its imagery. But some researchers consider it potentially the most fundamental barrier of all. It is the coordination problem at civilizational scale, the question of whether a complex, diverse, politically fragmented species can maintain the sustained multi-generational collective effort required to develop truly transformative technologies without fracturing along the way. Building a generationship or a world ship or any interstellar capability is not a project that one nation, one company, or one generation can complete. It requires a level of sustained, coordinated investment and commitment across multiple generations, across political and cultural divides, in service of a goal that will not bear fruit within the lifetimes of anyone who makes the initial sacrifices. Our track record on this kind of multi-generational coordination is, to put it generously, mixed. We struggle to maintain 30-year infrastructure commitments. We struggle to act decisively on century-scale climate projections. The idea of sustaining the focused, cooperative, multi-generational effort required to build and launch an interstellar vessel without it being derailed by political instability, shifting priorities, resource competition, or simple loss of will is not guaranteed. And if that is the filter, if most civilizations reach technological maturity and then simply fail to hold themselves together long enough to achieve the next step, then the silence of the cosmos reflects not catastrophic destruction, but something more mundane and more human, simple fragmentation, the inability to stay pointed in the same direction long enough to cross the threshold. I want to bring in something here that I think reframes all of this in a way that feels important, because the Fermi paradox, as I have described it so far, presents the silence as a mystery to be solved, a puzzle with a hidden answer that we are trying to find. but some of the most thoughtful researchers working at the intersection of astronomy, philosophy, and the study of civilization suggest that we are asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, "Why is nobody out there?" they suggest we ask, "What does it take to be the kind of civilization that survives long enough to be out there?" And when you frame it that way, when you think about civilizational survival as the central challenge, rather than interstellar travel as the central achievement, the conversation about generation ships becomes something much larger than a spacecraft design problem. It becomes a question about what we are capable of becoming, whether we have the wisdom to go along with our intelligence, whether the story of humanity is one that has a long continuation ahead of it, or one that has already reached its most significant chapters. The astronomer Carl Sagan, who spent much of his life thinking about exactly these questions, argued that the ability to develop interstellar travel and the ability to survive as a civilization were, in a deep sense, the same ability, that a species capable of sustaining the multi-generational cooperation, the long-term thinking, the collective wisdom required to build and operate an interstellar vessel was, almost by definition, a species that had figured out how to avoid destroying itself. The two capabilities were, for Sagan, inseparable. You could not have one without the other. And a civilization that destroyed itself before reaching the stars had, by that very destruction, demonstrated that it was not yet ready for them. That is a beautiful idea. It is also a challenging one, because it means that the Generationship problem, the question we started this whole conversation with, is not just a technical puzzle about materials and genetics and psychology and propulsion. It is, at its deepest level, a mirror. It reflects back at us the question of what kind of species we are choosing to become, whether we are the kind of civilization that can think across centuries, whether we can hold enough of the future in our minds to make sacrifices for it in the present, whether the silence of the cosmos reflects a filter that we are moving toward, or one that we have, against the odds, already passed. Now, I want to bring this back down from the philosophical to the concrete for a moment, because there are some genuinely exciting recent developments in the real-world science of both interstellar travel and the search for life that I think deserve attention here. Because this is not all abstract speculation. There are real missions, real telescopes, real discoveries that are sharpening our understanding of all of this in ways that would have seemed like science fiction not very long ago. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched on Christmas Day of 2021, after decades of development and cost overruns and near cancellations that form their own saga of multi-generational scientific commitment, is transforming our understanding of exoplanet atmospheres in ways that are directly relevant to the Generationship destination question. Webb is sensitive enough to analyze the atmospheric composition of planets orbiting other stars, to detect the chemical fingerprints of gases like carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and potentially oxygen in the atmospheres of worlds dozens of light years away. It has already detected carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of a planet called WASP-39b, making it the first direct detection of that molecule in an exoplanet atmosphere. It is now examining the atmospheres of rocky, potentially habitable planets in systems like TRAPPIST-1, a red dwarf star approximately 40 light-years from Earth that hosts 7 Earth-sized planets, at least 3 of which orbit within the habitable zone. The TRAPPIST-1 system is in many ways the most exciting nearby destination in the exoplanet catalogue right now. 7 worlds, all roughly Earth-sized, orbiting a single quiet red dwarf star. The innermost planets are likely too hot for liquid water, the outermost are likely too cold, but the 3 middle ones, designated TRAPPIST-1e, F, and G, sit within the habitable zone, and at least one of them, TRAPPIST-1e, is considered by some planetary scientists to be the most promising candidate for a genuinely Earth-like world yet identified. Webb is currently examining these planets in unprecedented detail, looking for the atmospheric chemical signatures that might indicate whether they are barren rocks, Venus-like hellscapes, or something more hospitable. The results so far are cautious but not discouraging. There is no confirmed detection of a rich Earth-like atmosphere on any TRAPPIST-1 planet yet, but the observations are ongoing, and the sensitivity of the telescope is extraordinary. We are, for the first time in human history, genuinely capable of beginning to answer the question of whether specific other worlds have the conditions for life as we know it. That is not a small thing. That is a civilizational milestone. And then there is the breakthrough Starshot initiative, funded by the late Russian-Israeli entrepreneur Yuri Milner and announced in 2016 with the involvement of Stephen Hawking, among others. The concept is audacious. Accelerate gram-scale laser-propelled light sails to 20% of the speed of light using an enormous ground-based laser array, and send a fleet of them to the Alpha Centauri system, which includes Proxima Centauri, to return images and data from close range within about 20 years of launch. No crew, obviously, no generation ship, just tiny robotic probes moving fast enough to reach another star within a human lifetime. The engineering challenges are formidable. The laser array required, with a combined output on the order of 100 gigawatts, does not exist and would cost many billions to build. The light sails themselves, small enough to be accelerated effectively, but large enough to collect the laser energy, need to be made from materials that do not yet exist in the required combination of properties. The communication system that would allow the probes to send data back from 4 light-years away at speeds making the transmission useful is another open problem. And surviving the passage through even the thin medium of interstellar space at 20% of light speed requires an extraordinary degree of miniaturized robustness. At those velocities, even a collision with a microscopic dust grain carries the energy of a small explosion, but the concept is physically sound. The lasers obey known physics. The light sails obey known physics. The trajectory calculations are straightforward. Breakthrough Starshot is not violating any laws of nature. It is simply pushing engineering to its absolute limit. And the serious scientists involved in the project are convinced that the engineering challenges, while enormous, are in principle solvable with technologies that could exist within the next few decades. If Starshot, or something like it, succeeds, if we send robotic probes to Proxima Centauri and receive back close-range images and atmospheric data from Proxima b, the potentially Earth-like planet orbiting in that system's habitable zone, the implications for the Generationship question are profound, because suddenly, the destination is not just a point of light in a telescope, it is a place, a specific characterized world with known or partially known conditions, a world that we can begin to plan for concretely, a world that gives the Generationship mission a real target, a real hope, a real reason grounded in evidence rather than just astronomical inference. And this connects to something I want to raise that ties the Fermi paradox, the search for life, and the Generationship question into a single extraordinary knot. It is the question of what we would actually do, as a species, as a civilization, if the James Webb Space Telescope or a future even more powerful observatory detected what astrobiologists call a biosignature in the atmosphere of one of the TRAPPIST-1 planets, a chemical signal, perhaps an anomalous abundance of oxygen or methane or nitrous oxide, in combinations that are thermodynamically unstable without a biological source to continuously replenish them. That strongly suggested the presence of living organisms on another world. What would that change? What would it mean for the Generationship project if we knew, not suspected, but had strong scientific evidence that the destination we were heading toward was already inhabited. By microbes, perhaps, or by something more complex, or even by something intelligent. Each of those possibilities raises questions of staggering ethical and practical complexity. Questions about the right of any species to send itself to another world that already has life of its own. Questions about contamination, biological contamination of a living alien biosphere by terrestrial organisms, or the reverse. Questions about what the existence of life elsewhere tells us about our own situation, our own place in the story of the cosmos, the detection of extraterrestrial life, even microbial life, even fossil life, even the faint atmospheric fingerprint of distant biology, would be, without any exaggeration, the most significant scientific discovery in human history. It would answer, in an instant, the question of whether life in the universe is a singular, improbable accident or a widespread and perhaps inevitable consequence of the chemistry of the cosmos. It would transform the context in which every subsequent conversation about interstellar travel takes place. And it would make the Generationship question not just a question about engineering and biology and psychology, but a question about what kind of presence humanity wants to be in a living cosmos. These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions that any individual, any government, any scientific body can answer alone. They are questions for our entire species. Questions that require exactly the kind of long-term, collective, multi-generational thinking that the Generationship project itself demands. Which is perhaps the deepest reason why thinking seriously about interstellar travel matters right now, even though the technology to attempt it does not yet exist. Not because the ships are coming soon, but because the thinking, the wisdom, the ethical framework, the civilizational maturity required to do it well needs to start developing now, long before the first keel plate of the first world ship is ever laid. Carl Sagan wrote, near the end of his life, that he could not shake the feeling that our fate as a species was tied to the stars, not in a mystical sense, in a purely physical one. The Earth is not permanent. The sun is not permanent. Every world that life has ever arisen on is temporary on long enough timescales. And the only kind of life that survives the impermanence of worlds is the kind that learns to move between them. Sagan thought that the universe had, in some sense, been working toward the moment when matter became conscious enough to wonder about itself, when the cosmos became capable of knowing itself through the eyes and minds of living things. And he thought that the continuation of that extraordinary process, the continuation of consciousness and curiosity and wonder in the universe, was worth almost any effort, any sacrifice, any difficulty. I find that perspective genuinely moving. I also find it clarifying, because it takes the Generationship question out of the realm of adventure and technology and places it in the context of something older and more important. The continuity of the living, wondering, questioning thing that we are. The refusal to accept that the story ends here, on this one beautiful, fragile world, spinning around this one ordinary star, in this one corner of a galaxy among hundreds of billions. But here is the open loop I want to leave you with before we move on, because we have been asking, throughout this whole conversation, how long a Generationship could survive. And we have explored the biology, the genetics, the psychology, the sociology, the engineering, the ecology, the cosmology, but there is one dimension of survival that we have not fully addressed yet, and it is the one that in some ways matters most. It is not about whether the ship holds together. It is not about whether the biosphere stays healthy. It is not about whether the people inside maintain their purpose and their sanity across the long dark between the stars. It is about what happens when they arrive. Because the journey, extraordinary as it is not the end of the story. And what the people on that ship encounter at their destination may present challenges that dwarf everything they faced during the crossing. Challenges that the most thoughtful generation ship designers are only beginning to seriously grapple with. Challenges that connect, in surprising ways, to some of the deepest questions in planetary science, astrobiology, and the philosophy of what it means to build a new home on an alien world. That is where we are going next. If you are still watching, you're the kind of person who needs more than surface-level answers. So make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. Every day this channel goes deeper into the questions that matter most and brings you back changed. Let us imagine for a moment that everything has gone right. Against all the odds, against the entropy and the radiation and the genetic drift and the psychological weight and the mechanical failures and the social fractures and all the thousand quiet ways that the dark between the stars might have undone them, the people on that ship have made it. Generations have been born and lived and died within those metal walls. Cultures have formed and shifted and reformed. Knowledge has been passed down, imperfectly but sufficiently, from parent to child to grandchild across the centuries. The biosphere in the ship's interior has cycled and renewed and adapted. The reactors have kept running, the hull has held, and now, for the first time in the memory of anyone alive on board, for the first time in the memory of anyone alive, anywhere in the history of this particular community of human beings, the star they have been sailing toward is not a point of light. It is a disk, a visible resolved, brilliant disk of light hanging in the forward viewports, growing incrementally brighter and larger with each passing day. The planet, the one that the astronomical surveys conducted centuries ago back on Earth, identified as a candidate worth crossing the void for, is visible now as a tiny crescent, pale and distant but real, unambiguously real, a world, a destination. What happens next? Here is the thing that almost every fictional treatment of the Generationship story gets wrong. It jumps straight from the moment of arrival to the moment of landing. The ship arrives, the crew descends, the new world begins. The transition is treated as a hinge point, an ending and a beginning simultaneously, and the enormous complexity of what actually has to happen between those two moments is glossed over in the excitement of the narrative payoff. But in reality, in the actual physics-constrained, biology-constrained, engineering-constrained reality of what arriving at an exoplanet system would mean, the moment of arrival is not the end of the hard part. In many ways, it is the beginning of the hardest part of all, because between the moment the ship enters the target star system and the moment any human being can safely set foot on the surface of the target world. Assuming there is a surface to set foot on, and assuming it is safe, neither of which can be assumed, there is a period of assessment, preparation, and adaptation that could last not weeks or months but years, possibly decades, possibly longer. Let us start with what the arriving crew would actually know about their destination. They would know what the astronomers back on Earth, centuries earlier, could determine from the light of the planet, its approximate size, its orbital period, its distance from its star, the rough composition of its atmosphere, if the telescopes of that era were sensitive enough to detect it. If they departed after the era of the James Webb Space Telescope and its successors, they might know considerably more: the presence or absence of water vapor, carbon dioxide, oxygen, methane in the atmosphere. They might have a rough sense of whether the planet's surface temperature is consistent with liquid water. They might even have biosignature data suggesting whether the atmosphere shows signs of biological activity. What they would not know, could not know, from light years away, is the texture of the reality on the ground, the specific composition of the soil, the detailed chemistry of the atmosphere at the surface level, the nature of the microbial communities, if any, that inhabit the world, the geological stability of the surface, the intensity and character of the local weather patterns, the precise gravitational field the planet generates at its surface, the magnetic field strength and structure, the radiation environment at ground level, shaped by the interaction of the star's output with the planet's magnetosphere and atmosphere. All of these things, which matter enormously for human habitability, can only be determined up close, from orbit, from atmospheric probes, from surface landers, from in-situ measurements taken by instruments touching actual rock and soil and air. This is why the most serious proposals for Generationship missions include not just the ship itself, but an extensive suite of robotic infrastructure that would be deployed upon arrival, potentially years or even decades before any human sets foot on the planet's surface. Orbital mapping satellites, atmospheric probes, surface landers and rovers, perhaps, eventually, robotic construction platforms that could begin preparing the surface for human habitation before any human arrives, establishing pressurized shelters, testing local resource extraction, characterizing the biological and chemical environment in detail. The model is not so different from what NASA envisions for human Mars missions, an extensive robotic precursor program that characterizes the environment, tests technologies, and establishes critical infrastructure before the first crew arrives. The difference, of course, is that on a Mars mission, you can send the robotic precursors ahead of time from Earth, using faster unmanned spacecraft, so that they arrive and operate for years before the crewed mission departs. On a Generationship mission, you have no such luxury. Everything has to arrive together: crew, robots, manufacturing capability, the full toolkit of exploration and construction. The robotic systems have to be carried on the ship for the entire voyage, maintained and kept ready across the centuries, and deployed upon arrival. The engineering demands of that requirement are once again staggering. You are asking robotic systems, sophisticated, sensor-laden, mechanically complex pieces of equipment, to remain functional and ready for deployment after centuries in storage. Some of those systems will need to be rebuilt from scratch using the ship's manufacturing capability after the voyage, because no robotic system we can currently build could survive centuries of storage in a radiation-saturated environment without significant degradation. Others might be maintained in a minimal power standby state, periodically serviced, their software updated, their mechanical systems checked and repaired, but the fundamental challenge is real. Arriving at a new star system with a fully functional suite of exploration technology after a voyage of centuries is not something we can simply assume. It has to be designed for from the very beginning. But let us assume, for the sake of continuing our thought experiment, that it works. The robotic systems deploy, the surveys begin, orbital observations are made, atmospheric samples are analyzed, surface landers touch down and begin characterizing the local environment, and over the course of months and years of intensive study, a picture of the target world begins to emerge. What might that picture look like? Here is where the science of planetary habitability, one of the most active and rapidly developing fields in modern astronomy, gives us some genuinely important guidance and some genuinely important warnings. The concept of the habitable zone, the range of orbital distances from a star where liquid water could exist on a planet's surface, is the starting point for most discussions of planetary habitability. But researchers in this field are increasingly emphasizing that the habitable zone is a necessary condition for surface habitability, not a sufficient one. A planet can orbit within the habitable zone of its star and still be completely uninhabitable for reasons that have nothing to do with its distance from the star. Consider Venus. Venus orbits within the inner edge of the Sun's habitable zone, just barely and uncomfortably close to that edge, but technically within it by some definitions. And yet Venus is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. Its surface temperature averages around 465 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Its atmospheric pressure at the surface is 90 times that of Earth at sea level. Its atmosphere is composed almost entirely of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid suspended in it. It rains sulfuric acid on Venus, the runaway greenhouse effect that transformed Venus from what may once have been a temperate, ocean-bearing world into the scorched hellscape it is today, is one of the most sobering case studies in planetary science, and a cautionary tale about how dramatically a world's climate can diverge from habitability even when its basic orbital parameters look promising. On the other end of the spectrum, consider Mars. Mars orbits within the outer habitable zone of the Sun, again barely and somewhat outside it by the most conservative definitions. And yet Mars today is a frozen, nearly airless desert with a surface pressure less than 1% of Earth's, bathed in ultraviolet radiation because it lacks a significant magnetic field to generate a protective magnetosphere, and so cold that carbon dioxide, dry ice, forms at its poles in winter. Yet geological and mineralogical evidence strongly suggests that Mars once had liquid water on its surface, rivers, lakes, possibly a shallow northern ocean. Something happened to Mars, most likely the loss of its magnetic field, followed by the gradual stripping of its atmosphere by the solar wind, that transformed a potentially habitable world into the place it is today. Both Venus and Mars are cautionary reminders that orbital position alone tells you remarkably little about what a world is actually like. The devil is in 1,000 details of planetary geology, atmospheric chemistry, magnetic field history, and stellar radiation environment that orbital distance simply does not capture. Now let us think about what this means for a generation ship arriving at, say, the TRAPPIST-1 system, one of the most discussed candidate destinations in the serious literature on interstellar travel. The TRAPPIST-1 star is a red dwarf, a type of star that is the most common in the galaxy, making up roughly 70 to 75% of all stellar objects. Red dwarfs are smaller, cooler, and dramatically less luminous than our Sun. Their habitable zones are correspondingly closer in. A habitable zone planet around a red dwarf orbits at a fraction of the distance that Earth orbits the Sun. The TRAPPIST-1 habitable zone planets orbit at distances ranging from roughly 0.2 to 0.4 astronomical units from their star, completing their orbits in anywhere from 6 to 19 Earth days. That proximity creates a problem that has no equivalent in our own solar system. At such close distances, the gravitational tidal forces exerted by the star on the planet are enormous, and those tidal forces operating over geological timescales tend to produce a state called tidal locking, where the planet's rotation rate synchronizes with its orbital period, so that the same hemisphere always faces the star and the opposite hemisphere always faces away. One side of the planet bakes in perpetual sunlight, the other freezes in perpetual darkness. The day side may be too hot for liquid water. The night side may be so cold that the atmosphere itself freezes out and precipitates to the surface. Whether tidally locked planets can sustain habitable conditions is one of the most actively debated questions in contemporary planetary science. Some climate models suggest that a sufficiently thick atmosphere, circulating heat from the day side to the night side through powerful wind systems, could maintain a narrow habitable band around the planet's terminator, the boundary between the eternal day and eternal night. Other models are less optimistic. The James Webb Space Telescope is currently generating real data on TRAPPIST-1 planets that is beginning to constrain these models, and those results will matter enormously for how we think about red dwarf planets as potential destinations. There is also the question of stellar activity. Red dwarfs, despite their small size and relatively low luminosity in visible light, are frequently intensely active in ways that matter profoundly for planetary habitability. Many red dwarfs produce powerful flares, sudden, violent releases of electromagnetic radiation and energetic particles that can be orders of magnitude more intense than the most powerful solar flares our Sun produces. For a planet orbiting close enough to be in the habitable zone of a red dwarf, these flares can deliver intense bursts of ultraviolet and X-ray radiation to the planetary surface, radiation that would be devastating to surface life as we know it, and that would also accelerate the stripping of the planetary atmosphere over geological time. TRAPPIST-1 itself appears to be a relatively quiet red dwarf by the standards of its class. It does flare, but not with the extreme frequency and intensity of some of its stellar cousins. Whether its habitable zone planets have retained enough atmosphere to protect surface life, and whether any surface life could have evolved effective protection against the flares that do occur, are questions that remain genuinely open. And they are questions that a generation ship arriving at that system would need to resolve before even beginning to plan surface operations. But let us be optimistic for a moment. Let us say the surveys reveal that one of the target world's hemispheres, perhaps the Terminator Zone, that narrow band between permanent day and permanent night, has conditions that are, in principle, survivable. Temperatures within a tolerable range, an atmosphere with breathable levels of oxygen and nitrogen, liquid water present at least in certain regions, no obvious catastrophic geological hazards. Even in that best-case scenario, the gap between survivable in principle and actually livable for the human beings who have just arrived after a centuries-long journey is vast. And bridging that gap would be the work of years, probably decades, involving challenges that are as much biological and medical as they are engineering challenges. Consider the atmosphere. Even if the planet's atmosphere contains oxygen at breathable concentrations, it will also contain everything else, every trace gas, every particulate, every molecule that the planet's geological processes, its biology, if any exists, its photochemistry and its history have introduced into the atmospheric mix. Some of those components might be benign, others might be subtly or acutely toxic to human physiology. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds from biological sources, fine mineral particulates from geological activity, all of these have analogues in Earth's atmosphere at trace levels, but the specific squeak present in an alien atmosphere and their specific concentrations cannot be predicted from first principles. Every breath taken outside a sealed environment would need to be preceded by detailed chemical characterization of what is in the air, and even after extensive characterization, the long-term health effects of chronic low-level exposure to alien atmospheric chemistry might only become apparent after years of habitation, potentially manifesting in ways that are difficult to trace back to their atmospheric source. The soil presents similar challenges. Earth's soil is not just ground-up rock. It is a complex living matrix of mineral particles, organic matter, water, air, and an extraordinary diversity of microbial life. Estimates suggest that a single teaspoon of healthy Earth soil contains billions of individual bacteria representing thousands of species, alongside fungi, archaea, protozoa, and a host of other organisms. That living complexity is what makes Earth soil fertile, what allows it to support plant growth, cycle nutrients, and maintain the biological processes that the entire surface ecosystem depends on. An alien world's soil, even one that has its own biology, will have a completely different chemical and biological composition. Growing Earth crops in alien soil, even if the physical conditions seem suitable, would be extraordinarily challenging. The pH might be wrong, the mineral balance might be wrong. The absence of the specific microbial communities that Earth plants have co-evolved with over hundreds of millions of years would likely result in severely compromised plant health. Even if the plants could physically survive, this is why the comprehensive biobank we discussed earlier, the library of Earth microbial communities, soil organisms, mycorrhizal fungi, and decomposer species, would be so critically important not just during the voyage but upon arrival. Establishing a genuinely productive agricultural base on an alien world would almost certainly require the active introduction and cultivation of Earth soil microbiota alongside the crops themselves, essentially terraforming the soil, transforming alien regolith into something resembling Earth soil at the microscale using the carried biological toolkit, before any reliable food production from the local environment could be established. And then there is the question that sits underneath all of these practical challenges, and that is, in some ways, the most profound one of all. The question that the discovery of any life on the target world, even microbial life, even the most primitive and seemingly simple biology, would make urgent and unavoidable. What do you owe to a world that was already alive before you arrived? This is not a new question in the history of human expansion. It is, in fact, one of the oldest and most painful questions in that history. The expansion of human populations into territories already inhabited by other peoples throughout the entirety of recorded history has produced a record that ranges from the profoundly inspiring to the catastrophically tragic. The patterns are well documented and, in the clearest cases, deeply morally troubling. The arrival of a technologically more capable population into a territory already occupied by a less technologically capable one has, with depressing regularity, resulted in the displacement, marginalization, or destruction of the original inhabitants. The mechanisms have varied: disease, direct conflict, ecological disruption, cultural erasure, but the outcomes have been similar enough, across enough independent historical examples, to suggest something uncomfortable about the dynamics of contact between populations with unequal technological reach. Now translate that history into the context of an interstellar mission arriving at a world that harbors indigenous life. The life in question would presumably be microbial. The probability of encountering complex multicellular life, let alone intelligent life, on the first world a Generationship visited is considered by most astrobiologists to be very low, but even microbial life raises serious ethical questions. A living biosphere, even one composed entirely of single-celled organisms, represents the product of billions of years of evolution on that world. It is the result of an independent origin of life, or the long unfolding of a lineage that arose at some point in that planet's geological past. It is, in a profound sense, irreplaceable. Once introduced terrestrial biology begins to interact with alien biology, the outcomes are impossible to predict. Competitive exclusion, where more aggressive or better adapted terrestrial organisms outcompete alien organisms for resources, could drive alien species to local or even global extinction. Horizontal gene transfer between terrestrial and alien microbes, if such transfer is even possible across the biochemical differences between independent origins of life, could have consequences that are genuinely unknowable in advance. The concept of planetary protection, the set of policies and procedures designed to prevent the biological contamination of other worlds by terrestrial organisms, and vice versa, is taken seriously by space agencies already, even in the context of robotic missions to Mars and Europa and Enceladus, worlds where no life has yet been confirmed, but where it might potentially exist. The protocols involved in sterilizing robotic spacecraft to minimize contamination risk are extensive and expensive. For a crewed mission, where the presence of human beings means the presence of an extraordinarily diverse and robust ecosystem of terrestrial microorganisms living on and in and around every crew member, the contamination challenge is orders of magnitude more severe. Human beings shed bacteria with every breath, every contact, every movement, preventing the introduction of terrestrial biology into an alien biosphere, while simultaneously inhabiting that biosphere is, in practical terms, probably impossible to achieve with perfect reliability. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and genuinely unsettled debates in contemporary astrobiology and space ethics. It is sometimes framed as the conflict between two values that are both legitimate and both deeply human, what researchers call the imperative to explore and settle versus the imperative to preserve. Both of these impulses are real, both are defensible, and in the context of a generation ship arriving at a living world, they come into direct and potentially irresolvable conflict. The imperative to explore and settle says, humanity's long-term survival requires that we become a multi-world and ultimately multi-star species. A civilization confined to a single planet is existentially fragile, vulnerable to asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemic disease, or the long-term changes in the sun's luminosity that will eventually render Earth uninhabitable. Spreading to other worlds is not just an adventure. It is an insurance policy for the continuation of consciousness and civilization in the universe. And if the cost of that insurance policy includes some degree of disruption to the microbial ecosystems of the worlds we settle, then perhaps that is a cost that is justified by the magnitude of what we are preserving, the entire human story, all of human culture and knowledge and potential, against the risk of total extinction. The imperative to preserve says, every independent origin of life in the universe is precious beyond calculation. If life on Earth is the only life in the cosmos, then we are alone and the universe is dark, and our survival matters above all else. But if life has arisen independently on multiple worlds, if the cosmos is genuinely alive in multiple places, then the destruction of any one of those independent lineages is an irreversible loss, not just scientifically, morally. A living world that we destroy in the process of settling it is a world whose story we ended before we could even read it. We might be trading the knowledge of what alien life is, of what it could become, of what it could tell us about the deepest questions of biology and cosmology, trading all of that for the convenience of a settlement site. These are not easy questions. They are not the kind of questions that have clean, logical, universally agreed upon answers. They are the kind of questions that a generation ship crew, arriving at their destination after centuries in the dark, shaped by a culture and an ethical framework that evolved in isolation from Earth's ongoing philosophical conversations, would need to answer for themselves, with no governing body to defer to, no interplanetary court to appeal to, no one watching and no one who could intervene even if they wanted to. The decisions made at that moment of arrival about how to approach the new world, how to assess its living status, how to balance the needs of the arriving community against whatever prior claim the world's existing biosphere might have. Those decisions would be among the most consequential any human community has ever made, and they would be made by people who, after centuries of isolation and cultural evolution, might think about ethics, about humanity's place in the cosmos, about what they owe to life and to worlds, in ways that are quite different from how we think about those things today. Which brings us, finally, to a question that I have been circling around throughout this entire exploration, and that I now want to address directly, because it is the question that underlies everything: the genetics, the psychology, the engineering, the ecology, the cosmology, the ethics, all of it. It is the question that the generationship problem ultimately reduces to, when you follow every thread to its logical end. Who do you become after 1,000 years in the dark? Not in a metaphorical sense, literally. What kind of human being, what kind of community, what kind of civilization emerges from the far end of a multi-generational crossing of interstellar space? And is that community still, in any meaningful sense, continuous with the one that stepped aboard at the beginning? We have touched on this question from several directions throughout our conversation. The genetic changes that accumulate over generations in a small, isolated population, the psychological and cultural changes wrought by centuries of isolation and constrained existence, the potential physiological changes resulting from life in reduced or artificial gravity, the way that cultural memory fades and mythology grows in its place, the way that the original mission can drift, transform, or be abandoned entirely as generations succeed each other in a world where the mission is the only world anyone has ever known. But I want to bring these threads together now into a single coherent picture, because when you do, when you look at the full scope of what a 1,000-year interstellar crossing would do to the human beings inside a generation ship, what you see is not simply a journey from one place to another. You see a transformation, a deep, slow, irreversible transformation of human beings into something that is related to us, descended from us, carrying our DNA, inheriting fragments of our language and our mythology and our knowledge, but that is not quite us anymore. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his intellectual life thinking about questions of personal identity across time, about what it means to say that the person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight. When the cells have turned over, the memories have subtly shifted, the neural connections have been reorganized by a night's dreaming. Parfit's unsettling conclusion was that personal identity is not a deep, metaphysically solid fact. It is a narrative, a story we tell about continuity that is, at the margins, always somewhat constructed, but larp that insight to a civilization rather than a single person. The generation ship community that arrives at its destination after 1,000 years is continuous in the narrative sense with the community that departed. There is an unbroken chain of descent, biological, cultural, historical. The people at the end can trace their lineage back, generation by generation, to the people at the beginning. Their language has evolved, but it is recognizably descended from the original language. Their cultural practices have transformed, but they carry echoes of the original culture. Their bodies have changed in subtle ways, but their DNA is recognizably human. And yet, in 1,000 years, our own civilization has gone from medieval feudalism to the edge of interstellar travel. Our language, our values, our understanding of the cosmos, our relationship to the natural world, our conception of justice and beauty, and what makes a life worth living, all of it has changed so dramatically that a person from 1,000 years ago, transported to our world, would find almost nothing familiar. The transformation is that profound, that complete. Now imagine a community that has undergone 1,000 years of transformation in the vastly more constrained, more intense, more isolated conditions of an interstellar vessel. The changes would not be the same as Earth's changes. They would be shaped by completely different pressures, different necessities, different available resources and constraints. But they would be no less profound, possibly more so. The community that steps out at the destination would be, in a very real sense, a new kind of human civilization, one that has never existed before, one that cannot be predicted from its origins. And perhaps that is the deepest answer to the question we started with. How long could a generation ship survive in deep space? The honest answer is, we do not know. The engineering challenges are enormous and not yet solved. The biological challenges are serious and not yet fully characterized. The psychological and social challenges may be the most difficult of all and the least amenable to simple technical solutions. The physics of the universe itself is working against the durability of every material thing on board, every moment of every day. But here is what I keep coming back to. The question of whether a generation ship could survive is at its heart. the same question as whether humanity itself could survive, not just in space, but here on Earth, across the same spans of time. Whether we can think across centuries, whether we can plan for people who have not been born yet, whether we can build institutions and cultures and ecological systems that endure, whether we can find, in the face of all the forces of entropy and fragmentation and loss of purpose, the collective will to keep going, to keep the systems running and the knowledge alive and the community coherent and the mission meaningful, generation after generation, in the dark, without any guarantee of success. That is not a question about spacecraft, it is a question about us, and the fact that we are asking it seriously, rigorously, with real science and real mathematics and real philosophical depth suggests something important. It suggests that we are, at least, the kind of species that thinks about these things, that cares enough about the future to try to understand it, that looks up at the stars and wonders not just what is out there, but whether we have what it takes to find out. That wondering, I think, is where the journey begins. It has always been where the journey begins. Our job, the one that falls to us, living in this specific moment, is simpler and harder than building the ship itself. Our job is to be the kind of civilization that could, in principle, build it, to develop the science, to sustain the institutions, to cultivate the long-term thinking, to treat the pale blue dot with the care it deserves, so that the civilization that eventually reaches the stars is one that carries something worth carrying, not just our technology, not just our biology, but our best values, our curiosity, our capacity for wonder, our love for each other and for the living world, and for the extraordinary, improbable fact that we exist at all and get to ask these questions. How long could a generation ship survive in deep space? The honest answer is, we do not know yet. But the more important answer, the one that actually determines the outcome, is exactly as long as we deserve. Exactly as long as we are willing to do the work, ask the hard questions, sustain the long-term thinking, and keep the mission alive, not just on a ship, but here on the ground, in the choices of the civilization that will one day build one. The stars are patient. They have been there for billions of years, and they will be there for billions more. The question is whether we will still be here, still wondering, still reaching, still refusing to accept that the pale blue dot is the whole of our story. When the moment comes to finally make the crossing, I believe we will be. I believe that because of science, because of the extraordinary, accelerating pace of human discovery and technological development. But more than that, I believe it because of something that science does not measure, but that every person who has ever looked up at a clear night sky and felt that wordless pull already knows. We are built for this. The wanting is older than civilization. The curiosity is older than language. The refusal to accept that the horizon is the end of the world is as deep in us as anything we have. The generation ship will be built. Maybe not in the form we imagine today, maybe not on the timeline we hope for, but somewhere in the deep future of a civilization that started from this pale blue dot and refused to stop, someone will look back at us, at this moment, this conversation, this question, and feel what we feel when we think about the first human beings who looked at the ocean and decided to cross it. They will feel gratitude and recognition, and the particular, profound solidarity of people who understand that the journey they are on began long before them and will continue long after. We are the ancestors. Let us be worthy of what comes next. And if everything we just talked about lit something up in you, then you need to watch this next video on the screen, because the destination we've been dreaming about is not as welcoming as it sounds. In this video, we explore why the journey to Proxima Centauri is scarier than we think. I will see you there.